Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us for the Rocky Mountain MS Center Spring Education Summit. My name is Gina Hensrud, and I'm CEO of the center. We are so grateful that you've chosen to spend this Saturday morning with us. And most importantly, we hope that everyone is staying safe and healthy, and of course, following the guidelines of your local health departments wherever you might be joining us from today. Due to the COVID-19 climate we're all living in, we decided that moving the Education Summit fully online would be best this time around. This enables us to still bring you the important information that you'll be hearing from our team, despite the unusual circumstances we're all dealing with. Today's format will be a little different than you may be used to if you've attended education summits in the past. We've pre-recorded today's presentations. That means we won't have our usual Q&A session. It will provide you with a smoother experience, and you'll be able to submit questions about the presentation topics this weekend, and we will record answers to them over the next week. Shortly, you'll hear from 5 members of our medical team about a wide range of topics, including maximizing lifelong brain health, clarifying information on DMT categories, new MS medications, exercise and fatigue in MS, and an update on the COVID-19 situation and what it means for those living with MS. I would like to especially thank the exhibitors at today's event and invite you to visit them in our virtual exhibit hall: Alexion, Biogen, EMD Serono, Genentech, and Sanofi Genzyme. If you haven't already, we hope you will take the time to look at our virtual exhibit hall. You can find the links to it in any of the emails you received from us before or after today's event. We also are thankful to have received patient education grants and sponsorships for our programs from Biogen, Bristol Myers Squibb, EMD Serono, and Genentech. We are able to continue to bring you the Ed Summit at no cost thanks to the generous support of these companies, as well as from donations from individuals like yourselves. I invite you to please help support our ongoing work. If you're able to make a gift of any size at this time, please visit mscenter.org/donate. Thank you again for helping make this event possible and for joining us today. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our MC for this morning, Kelsey Lance. Kelsey is our education manager at the Rocky Mountain MS Center. She coordinates the logistics and details for the in-person and online education programming that we provide. She's also a co-presenter for our MS 101 classes. Now, enjoy the summit.
Thank you, Gina. Now, as Gina mentioned, we are excited to be able to continue bringing you the top-notch educational programming that you've come to expect from the Rocky Mountain MS Center, while encouraging everyone to be safe at home. I'm personally thrilled to be able to talk us through the Ed Summit today because I'm normally behind the scenes at these events. I saw a number of familiar names on the registration list, and I would just like to say thank you to everyone for watching from around the country today. Because this event is entirely online and has been pre-recorded, a few things will look different for you, the viewers. We will not be holding a live Q&A session. Instead, we will be collecting questions over the weekend through the comments on the YouTube video and in our email. We will record the answers over the next week to post on our social media. We will also archive the entire collection of questions and answers on our website with the rest of the Education Summit. You can submit questions about the presentation topics to education@mscenter.org until Monday evening. Our exhibit hall also looks different today. We are so appreciative of our exhibitors who are participating in our virtual exhibit hall. You can see each company and read about them through the link listed in the description on YouTube, as well as in the emails you've received about this event. Finally, I would love to invite you all to fill out our online evaluation form. We read through all of the responses and use them to improve future events. Particularly since we're doing so many new things for this one, we would love to hear from you on what worked and what didn't. You can also submit questions using the evaluation form. After every 2 presentations, we will have a 3-minute break. If you need more than 3 minutes and you are watching on YouTube Live, you can press pause and the video will resume where you left off when you press play again. We'll also be archiving all of the presentations on our website so you can replay them in the future at any time. Our first presenter today is Dr. Timothy Vollmer. Dr. Vollmer is the MS Center's medical director and co-director at the Rocky Mountain MS Center at University of Colorado. He has participated in more than 100 clinical studies in MS. Today, Dr. Vollmer will be discussing maximizing lifelong brain health in MS.
Hello, welcome to the Rocky Mountain MS Center Spring Summit. As you know, I'm the medical director and professor of neurology at the University of Colorado. I'm sorry we can't do this in person, but hopefully you will find some of the information provided by myself and my colleagues useful today. So I'm going to be talking about the concept of brain health in general for all of us, as well as special issues related to patients with MS. And our goal here is to really empower you in order to help you make the best decisions you can about your care and your life. Okay. Before I do that, I'd like to just briefly introduce you to the Rocky Mountain MS Center and the Rocky Mountain MS Clinic. The Rocky Mountain MS Center is a community-based nonprofit organization established over 40 years ago. It's been involved in patient care, research, and education through all that time. In 2008, I returned to Colorado and joined the Rocky Mountain MS Center as their medical director. At the same time, joined the Colorado University School of Medicine, where we established the Rocky Mountain MS Clinic. And that clinic now has 7 neurologists, 3 advanced practitioners, and about 10,000 patient visits per year with roughly 4,000 distinct patients. Not all of them are MS. We also deal with other inflammatory diseases of the brain, including neuromyelitis optica, autoimmune encephalitis, neurosarcoid, and others. We have a very active clinical research program. And our team is somewhat unique in the world in that we try to decrease practice variation among ourselves by discussing any differences in the way that we're treating a patient, and then use the data that's been published or generate our own data to allow us to make the best decision and optimize patient care. This relationship with the Rocky Mountain MS Center and the University of Colorado Hospital and the University of Colorado School of Medicine has been very productive, and the Rocky Mountain MS Center has supported a great deal of our research over the years. So the topics for today are going to be focused initially on talking about the concept of brain health and issues in MS that may impact this. And then I would like to switch gears and talk about a new biology of MS that is emerging that's quite different than the traditional view of the immunology of MS. And the reason for this is to lay a foundation for the third talk, part of the talk, which is to talk about how astrocytes are key players both in the process of injuring the central nervous system, but also key opportunities for repair and neuroprotection in MS. And then briefly close on biomarkers and explain briefly how these new biomarkers that we are studying are going to help us as we continue to understand this biology of MS and improve treatments for patients with MS. So first thing, brain volume and neurological reserve. Brain volume is a reflection of how many nerve cells you have in your brain. And neurological reserve is just the concept that the brain has extra capacity and it can compensate for a certain amount of injury. And I'll explain why that's important. Now, neurological reserve can buffer for subclinical injury to the brain, such as a minor closed head injury that does cause some injury to the brain, but doesn't result in any symptoms. But it also is related to how much recovery function you can get after a significant brain injury that does cause symptoms. And so building and maintaining neurological reserve is very important to help the brain compensate for the normal events that happen in life. To talk about that, we need to have some nomenclature that we all share. In this cartoon of the different cells that make up the brain are basically 4 different types. So neurons, which are the whole point of the brain. Neurons are the little computers that are sensing information and processing it and allow us then to behave and respond accordingly. All the other cells in the brain are there to support neurons. The oligodendrocytes are the cells that make the myelin. And the myelin is the fatty sheath around the nerve fibers that helps the nerve fibers conduct signals at a faster rate. Traditional thinking about MS has focused on oligodendrocytes as the primary target for the immune attack in multiple sclerosis. But I'm going to share some data with you to suggest that's probably not the case, and that rather it's the third component, the astrocytes, that actually may be the first target in MS. And I'll explain how that impacts the rest of the functioning. Microglia are just part of the immune system and are there to help protect the brain. So the key players for us today are the neurons, which are lost in MS, the oligodendrocytes, which are also lost in MS, and then the astrocytes and the roles that they play in the loss of those 2 cell types. So let's talk about just the natural history of the brain here for a second. We're born with pretty much all of the neurons we're ever going to have. And yet the brain continues to expand in size from birth to about age 20. And that expansion in brain size is due to proliferation of those other cell types, the oligodendrocytes and the astrocytes in particular, and also expansion of the neuronal synaptic network, the number of connections between your nerve cells. So that network of connections expands as we grow and develop new skills. Until about age 20. And about age 20, our brains reach maximum size, and they're pretty stable until we reach our 30s. And then in all of us, we begin to lose nerve cells, which is demonstrated by a slow decrease in brain volume. And I'll come back to that. So this loss of brain volume that occurs beginning in the 30s and 40s is important because it is potentially going to cause us to lose some neurological function, particularly late in life. So again, neurological reserve, trying to expand and enhance it, is important just to compensate for this normal effect of aging. Now, how do you build neurological reserve? I'll go over that in just a second. So first thing, talking about brain volume changes in multiple sclerosis. In this study done by our colleagues in Southern California, they looked at multiple sclerosis and then corrected the amount of brain volume loss for just normal brain volume loss that occurs as normal part of aging. And what you can see here in red is the normal loss of brain volume at age 30, 40, 50, and 60. And this panel up here is looking at whole brain volumes. And what you can see is that initially at age 30, almost all the brain volume loss is really related mostly to MS. But as we age, particularly up in our 60s, the majority of the brain volume loss is now due to aging. This has an implication that if you're trying to prevent brain volume loss due to MS, you want to treat back here, because once you get up here, you can only treat a very small part of the brain volume loss, and therefore you have a relatively small impact on the outcomes. This is also reflected in subunits in the brain, the thalamus. You can see the same basic pattern. It's different, however, in the caudate and the putamen. We don't know quite why that is. Now, the relevance of this difference in terms of how much brain volume loss is due to aging and how much is due to MS is reflected in studies of outcomes of MS patients. So I'm going to argue that the loss of neurological reserve actually is the cause of the progressive form of the disease. And in this study, down in this panel here, done by our colleagues in England a number of years ago using alemtuzumab, but they showed that they monitored patients for a year, and in the blue is progressive patients, and the red is MS patients, relapsing-remitting MS patients. They treated them here at this point with the alemtuzumab. And what you can see is that 6 months later, the patients that had relapsing-remitting MS actually improved substantially by 2 full points on an 8-point scale, which is very good. But the progressive patients still were a little bit worse, but not changing as fast as they did the year before. And that was true at month 12, 18, and actually out to month 36. So the relapsing-remitting patients are able to get better, and that's because they still have neurological reserve. But the progressive patients were slowly worsening, and I would argue this worsening here is due to this loss of brain volume, which is due to aging up here. Okay. So neurological reserve in MS is the capacity of the brain to compensate for MS disease, and most lesions that form in the brain due to MS are actually clinically silent. 90 to 95% are not detected by the patient or the physician by exam or history. They're only seen on MRI. But they are causing damage to the brain. The brain is shrinking at an accelerated rate, as I just showed you. The neurological reserve is not just related to cognitive function. It's also related to motor function and sensory function. And because of neurological reserve, the diagnosis of MS is often delayed. Again, if 90 to 95% of lesions are clinically silent, you can easily imagine that a patient may accumulate a fair amount of damage to the brain before we actually have a lesion that causes symptoms that leads them to the healthcare system and a diagnosis. And also that loss of neurological reserve is the cause of progressive disability. But patients can increase neurological reserve, as all of us can, by living an active, healthy lifestyle. And what this means is that we have to adopt an active exercise program, because as you exercise, the neurons that are firing begin to make new connections, and they expand the size of the synaptic network that allows the brain to work. Also, eating a healthy diet to avoid comorbidities such as diabetes or hypertension or other diseases is important, because they also damage the brain, and that increases the disability from multiple sclerosis. Also, being socially and creatively active is really important. All those activities Every time you learn something new, you make new connections in the brain, and that expands the neurological network, and that increases your neurological reserve. So an active, healthy lifestyle and a healthy diet are key parts of maximizing neurological reserve and therefore brain health over a lifetime. I did want to go a little bit more into other factors for neurological reserve than I have before. And this is a figure from a new paper that we have coming out. So if you look up here at the top of the various inputs that determine how much neurological reserve you have, there are genetic and inborn factors, and they lead to how big your brain is going to be and how much reserve you're going to have if everything goes perfectly. And then you've got neural network function, and this is early life activities. This is where children go to school, play, learn to play musical instruments, read, etc. That expands the neural network, and that increases neurological reserve. But then you also can have environmental factors such as growing up in a war zone or being malnourished. That could decrease the amount of neurological reserve you have, or you could have diseases such as multiple sclerosis, which tends to start in early life, that also decreases the amount of neurological reserve. And these are interacting with other factors that we can measure in terms of what you're doing now, current activities that you're doing to increase neurological reserve versus what you've done in the past. And there are also other genetically determined disease-related characteristics that determine the overall reserve. And neurological reserve isn't evenly distributed throughout the brain. It can be different for different subsystems in the brain. So the motor system will have a certain amount of reserve capacity, cognitive system will have a certain amount of reserve capacity, sensory symptoms, visual symptoms, etc. So it is a complex concept. In this graph here, we're just showing what we see happening in MS. So the top line is just normal aging, happens to all of us. The problem with multiple sclerosis is that the preclinical phase, we lose brain volume. That continues if we don't treat the disease, and they get to a point where they just don't have enough reserve capacity to avoid disability. Here. In this bottom graph, we're just trying to demonstrate the different forms of MS that we identify are really all part of a continuum. So the very earliest form of MS is radiologic isolated syndrome, where a person has an MRI because they had a headache or something, and then we see evidence of MS on that. Again, most MS lesions are subclinical, so this is not an uncommon finding. Clinical isolated syndrome are patients who just had one symptom, and then relapsing MS patients, by definition, have had two or more events that led to neurological symptoms. And these patients then move into secondary progressive disease. Primary progressive disease, though, doesn't have the relapses, so it just goes directly into the progressive phase of the disease. And this appears to be mainly just a matter of luck. We have not been able to identify any real biological differences between patients that develop primary progressive disease and those that go in the relapsing pathway. So let's switch gears now and talk a little bit about the new biology of MS. To do that, I'd like to review with you a little bit the traditional view of MS, and that is that it's driven by T cells, which are recognizing molecules that are coming from the myelin, myelin-basic protein, protein, MOG, etc. And a B cell or other cells work with the T cell to demonstrate or show this molecule to the T cell in a way that it can see it, which then activates it and leads to it releasing a lot of small molecules called cytokines that then lead to a whole cascade of events happening. And again, this whole concept is that it's really coming through this interaction with some antigen coming from the myelin. This is supported strongly by the animal model, which is called experimental autoimmune encephalomyelitis. The problem is we've never been able to find this myelin antigen in humans, nor do we find the kind of T cells that we find in the mouse model in humans in a reliable fashion. What we do find are B cells that are responding to something in the brain, and these cells have now become the real focus for what we're trying to do in terms of improving treatment options. So the first thing to understand how things have changed over the last several years is to understand lymphatics in the brain. Lymphatics are small tubes that we have throughout our body that help drain excess water out of tissues. And in doing so, they also carry various molecules. And these tubes is a vascular system that drains into lymph nodes. And then it's the lymph nodes where lymphocytes and T cells, B cells, and other kind of immune cells are. And there's screening that fluid as it goes through to see if there's anything in it that suggests infection or tissue damage. And if there is, then the lymph nodes begin to respond to that. Up until 2014, it was not believed that there were lymphatics in the brain. And it was very unclear how molecules in the brain might be setting off an autoimmune attack that would lead to MS. But in 2014, a group in the University of Virginia identified that there actually are lymphatics in the membranes around the brain, and these lymphatics are imaged here in this MRI. So the green markings here is where dye that was injected into the bloodstream and then leaked into the brain is now being cleared by those lymphatics as it drains out with the excess cerebrospinal fluid. And these drain into lymph nodes that are at the base of the skull, called the deep cervical lymph node chain. And that's turned out to be very important. So again, we have these lymphatics are in the meninges around the brain, and they're draining out to the deep cervical lymph nodes. And so what's happening is that immune cells move into the brain and may get activated there, but they also then drain out through these lymphatics, and they end up in these deep cervical lymph nodes. Spinal fluid's coming out, and spinal fluid is carrying various proteins and other molecules from the brain. And somewhere in that process, it sets off a cascade of events that leads to production of a type of a B lymphocyte, the cells that make antibodies, that then can cause inflammation in the brain. And so those B cells expand in the lymph node, they then re-enter the circulation, they flow into the bloodstream, and they cross the blood-brain barrier. And there they interact with some molecule or cell that activates them, and then they get T cells and other cells involved, and they bring a whole lot of different parts of the immune system into the brain that causes a focal area of inflammation and ultimately damage. Recent data from John Prinius suggests that these B cells are initially killing the astrocytes that are normally in the brain. In fact, half the volume of the brain is made by astrocytes. And so initially, astrocytes are dying, and then they come back from neural stem cells and are repopulated. When they come back, they're now pro-inflammatory, called A1 astrocytes. And these astrocytes are producing toxic molecules, nitric oxide, true necrosis factor, and other molecules. And these molecules can damage and kill other cell types, including neurons, oligodendrocytes, and actually destroying the axon as well. So it does not appear right now that the attack on the neuron and oligodendrocytes is directly from the T cell B cell. It appears that it's an indirect consequence of these T cells, B cells interacting, recognizing some antigen that the B cell is now specific for, and that produces these hormone-like substances, these cytokines, that then activate the astrocytes, in addition to possibly killing them initially. So this whole process is much more complicated than was originally thought, but it does give us additional opportunities to actually improve treatment options for MS patients. Traditionally, we thought just focusing on this T cell B cell interaction over here was the primary goal to shut off the inflammatory disease in MS. We now think, though, that targeting these cells is actually a therapeutic opportunity, and in fact, one that we've already taken. So of all the drugs that we currently have approved for MS, which there's a lot, only one of them was actually developed based on the mouse model, and that's Tysabri. All the other drugs that were developed were empirically derived. In other words, it was because of some effect that they were thought to have in other diseases that somebody thought might be relevant to MS that caused them to actually be tried in MS. The Timiracetide over here was actually an accident in the laboratory. But what I've done here is I've just listed all the drugs. The ones in black are actually the ones that are working at the lymphocyte level, the T cells and B cells, and trying to decrease disease activity. And some of the most effective ones are these monoclonal antibodies like rituximab, ocrelizumab, rituximab, ofatumumab, which are all antibodies that directly target the B cell. And that's actually where our knowledge that B cells are key drivers of the disease came from, was the success of these trials. But there are also drugs that we have, which is Tecfidera, Vumerity, Gilenya, Mayzent, and some new ones coming out, and Copaxone, that actually seem to work primarily through astrocytes. And these drugs penetrate the blood-brain barrier. Actually, they get concentrated in the brain, and they interfere with a certain set of signaling pathways that I'll show you in a second. And so their clinical effect can be demonstrated to be due to their ability to inhibit those pro-inflammatory astrocytes. Whereas Copaxone works by developing a B cell that is anti-inflammatory and gets activated in the brain and turns down this process. So let's talk about astrocytes as a new target for neurological repair. So again, To go back to astrocytes are the support cells. These are cells that make up the bulk of the volume of the brain. They surround all neurons and all oligodendrocytes and provide nutrients to them, take away waste, and provide a lot of other support. So these are really key cells and they're very important. But they also can act like an immune cell. So there's in the nucleus of these astrocytes, there's a signaling pathways that can be affected by various agents, pro-inflammatory agents, molecules from areas of damage, our drugs from gamma IL-6. FGY720 is actually gelinia, and it can impact astrocytes because it binds to a receptor called an S1P receptor. And the pathway that leads to the damage in MS is this pathway called NF-kappa B. And when this pathway is activated, it leads to the astrocytes becoming pro-inflammatory. They produce cytokines, they upregulate adhesion molecules that attract more immune cells into the brain. And they also produce nitric oxide, tumor necrosis factor, and other things. But there's another signaling pathway called STAT3 that if you activate that pathway, it actually blocks the inflammatory phase and causes the astrocytes to reduce inflammation, decrease the infiltration of immune cells and demyelination, and help repair the scar to allow the oligodendrocytes and the neurons to begin to regrow and develop new connections. So right now, there's FGY720 or gelinia that does seem to do, at least inhibiting the NF-kappa B part. We're not quite sure whether it activates the STAT3 pathway. But in fact, there are a number of other molecules now that are available that can do this. This list is a long list. These are the traditional approaches to try to remyelinate. And I'm not going to talk about them very much because they haven't gone very far. But I did want to mention one thing, and that is biotin. Biotin's phase 3 trial was completed earlier this year. It did not show benefit. And so people are taking biotin because they hope that it's going to help repair the nervous system in MS. Unfortunately, it does not seem to have a significant effect. It can interfere with certain blood tests, and so I would recommend probably not taking high-dose biotin. The other drugs I've talked about before, but I did want to talk about two key ones down here. One's metformin. Metformin was recently studied as a way to recover function in the animal model of MS called EAE by Robin Franklin in London. And the reason that he did that experiment is because metformin is a very commonly prescribed drug for type 2 diabetes. And observing people with diabetes on this drug found that if they had a stroke, their stroke tended to be less severe and they recovered better from it than people not on metformin. And metformin does work through astrocytes. It seems to promote that more neuroprotective astrocyte through the STAT3 signaling pathway. So this is a drug I'm actually very excited about and would like to get into clinical trials right away. Then the other one is elezanumab. This is a monoclonal antibody that works in the MS plaque by blocking a molecule called repulsive guidance molecule A. And that molecule is overexpressed in the MS plaques and prevents the oligodendrocytes from remyelinating, also prevents neurons from making new sprouts and reconnecting to the neuronal network. So we have already elezanumab in clinical trials, and metformin will be in clinical trials shortly, hopefully at multiple places. So finally, just to close here, talk just a bit about biomarkers. So biomarkers are things that we can find in bodily fluids that tell us that something's happening in some compartment. In the case of multiple sclerosis, we would very much like to be able to monitor the neurons, the oligodendrocytes, and the astrocytes in terms of injury and activation. But the problem is we've never been able to do that on a regular basis because it required spinal fluid. But now we have technology that's very sensitive, can detect one molecule out of 10 with 15 zeros after it. And that allows us to actually monitor blood samples and looking at markers of injury going on inside the brain. And we've shown in our studies here that GFAP, which is a marker of astrocytes, is elevated in the blood in patients during active disease, as is neurofilament light, which is a protein that comes from the nerve axon. And that these two are actually very good markers of disease activity, and I think are probably more sensitive than even MRI is. I expect they will be in the clinic by the end of this year or early next year as a regular way to monitor it. But right now, they can be used in early phase studies to study drugs that might be neuroprotective or anti-inflammatory, which would allow us to study far fewer patients and do the study much more rapidly. and also be used to monitor patients who are on therapies to make sure that they're getting full treatment effect and to help us adjust therapies when they're not getting full treatment effect. I think it will also help us with progressive disease and understanding a little bit more about it and how we can treat it more effectively. So all of these things are coming together where we are moving into an era where we will be doing more research on neurological repair and recovery of function, as well as neuroprotection to improve function late in life, not just for MS patients, possibly for other people as well. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter will be discussing a question that comes up often in our speaker series, Conversations on MS. If you've not attended one of these speaker events before, I highly recommend them. Traditionally, one of the doctors from the clinic will travel to a Colorado library and will spend an hour and a half answering questions from the audience. It's a great time to get clarification on topics and questions you have about MS. This year, we are taking the series virtual. Make sure you're on our email list to find out about participating in one of these events. The next presenter is Dr. John Corboy, who will clear up some confusion about generic, biosimilar, and off-label DMTs. Dr. Corboy is the co-director at the Rocky Mountain MS Center at University of Colorado. His research interests and projects include novel therapeutics for MS, treatment decisions in MS care, understanding how long to use conventional DMTs, and defining risk factors for developing MS.
Hi, good morning. This is Dr. John Corboy of the University of Colorado and the Rocky Mountain MS Center at the University of Colorado. I'm also the co-director of the Rocky Mountain MS Center at the University of Colorado with Dr. Vollmer. Thank you very much for joining us today in these unusual pandemic times. I hope everyone is safe and will remain safe and have a productive spring and summer. Today, we're going to talk about a variety of interesting topics. And the topic that I would like to talk about has to do with the large collection of different types of medications we have, including those in the same families, those at different doses, those that are generic, biosimilars. What do these all mean? They're all very confusing, different terms, different concepts. So I'd like to sort of introduce the idea and show you some examples of these different variations on a theme of the many different medications that we now have available. Generics, biosimilars, dose differences, class expansion, off-label medications in MS. What does this all mean? Here are my disclosures, the research support consulting speaking honorarium, as well as I am the editor of Neurology Clinical Practice. And I will say that there will be some very modest discussion of off-label use today as well of medications. So this is now the modern era of treatment with approved medications in the United States of disease-modifying therapies for multiple sclerosis. I happened to finish my fellowship in 1992 when we had essentially, to treat multiple sclerosis, we had baclofen pretty much and steroids. There were some trials that were starting then, and we're actually finishing up with the interferons, and then with interferon beta-1b or beta-seron in 1993 up through very recently with the most recent approval on March 26th of this year of ozanimod, Zeposia is the trade name for that. We now have well over 20 different molecules available, including generics, biosimilars, and any of a variety of other agents. So this can be quite confusing. And here are just a couple of highlights in bold, just to note a couple of very important time marks in our history with the use of the medications. Interferon beta-1b, as I mentioned, was the very first drug, beta-seron. And then we had several other drugs that were similar with the exception of mitoxantrone, which was really an old chemotherapy that was repurposed. But the biggest next change occurred almost 11 years later with natalizumab Tysabri. This was an IV formulation, as was mitoxantrone, but it was notably different in that it was a highly selective molecule that was a monoclonal antibody, and that ushered in a new era of more highly effective therapies, but also the use of very targeted molecules, unlike mitoxantrone, which was a chemotherapy and had significant effects on the bone marrow and other organs. This is a very targeted molecule, and that was a very different and important change. Fingolimod, 6 years later in 2010, marked the first time that we had an oral medication. And that was a substantial move forward because a lot of people did not tolerate the injections at home, or for a variety of reasons, perhaps I didn't wish to use natalizumab because of the risk of PML, the brain infection associated with that, or they couldn't tolerate it, or other reasons. So having the advantage of an oral medication you could take at home was a big move up. Alemtuzumab is marked in 2014 because that is notable for being the second monoclonal antibody, but also perhaps ushering in a phase where there perhaps was a significant increase in some of the risks that are seen in a highly effective molecule, though, and managing those risks became an even more important issue. In 2015, we had the first set of generics, the first generic for Copaxone or glatiramer acetate, and that was called Glatopa, still is called Glatopa. And this represents the first generic into the marketplace. Daclizumab is noted because it was removed from the market, as was Tysabri very briefly, but daclizumab was taken off the market permanently in 2018 due to side effects. Ocrelizumab represents, in 2017, the very first molecule in a class of molecules that we'll discuss a little bit more later that has expanded over time and will expand presumably further in a few months. Siponimod represents the second agent very similar to fingolimod, Gilenya, and siponimod is named Mayzent. That is important because that represents an expansion of a class. And we now have ozanimod as well, as you can see on the bottom, just approved several weeks ago. Similarly, diroximel fumarate below that represents a couple of different things. It represents another expansion of a class similar to dimethyl fumarate, Tecfidera, which is available since 2013, but also it represents something that we might refer to as a prodrug. I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So a lot of different topics thrown in there together, and let's talk about a few of them. One thing to talk about is how do we classify the medicines? We can classify them many, many different ways. Oftentimes people classify them simply by how they're taken. That has nothing to do with how effective they are or side effects or anything else, but it is important because that will affect how people use the medication, how they tolerate the medication. And this can be by injection, orally, or by IV infusion. Also importantly, efficacy. How effective are these medications? How well do they work? And we can sort of broadly push them into the category of low, medium, and high. And I think you'll have a discussion perhaps today with Dr. Gross about more details of the medications. Can also talk about risk. That is long-term risk, not just short-term side effects, but long-term risks. Again, these can be categorized somewhat as low, medium, and high, with some having really no long-term risks, such as Copaxone, glatiramer acetate, and some having somewhat higher risks, as I mentioned, alemtuzumab, but others as well. We can talk about classifying them by broad overall function. Do they suppress the immune system? Do they simply modulate the immune system without suppressing it? And then what we'd like to talk about in the future is whether or not we have repair molecules or remyelination molecules. Presently, these are not available, which is why they're in italics, but there's a lot of work being done on both of those topics. We can also talk about literally the mechanism of action. How does the drug actually act, and how does that affect the immune system in such a way that it would produce what we would hope for in terms of suppressing the new attacks and new problems with multiple sclerosis. We can also talk about the effect of the mechanism of action, which actually is the downstream outcome. So, for example, I'll show you in a moment how fingolimod and related molecules work, and then the effect of that is somewhat different between the different molecules. And that would get at the issue of the mixture of the mechanism of action and the effect of the mechanism of action. We can look at classes and the names. And starting on the upper left, interferon beta, all of the original interferons, beta-serin, Avonex, Rebif, and then Plegridy, and glatiramer acetate, we call really immunomodulators. They don't suppress the immune system. There's no significant increased risk of infections or cancers. They modulate the immune system in a variety of different ways that ultimately result in less relapses, less new scan changes, less progression of disability. Mitoxantrone and cladribine are really chemotherapies. They were developed as chemotherapies to treat leukemias and breast cancers and other cancers. And they really have significant impacts on bone marrow function, as well as development and maintenance of different immune-based cells, as well as other cells. Nayalizumab, going down further on the right, as I noted, Tysabri was the first monoclonal antibody in our system, and it was associated with a specific effect of attaching onto a molecule, integrin, and blocking the function of that integrin. And that was very effective for multiple sclerosis and remains so now. And that is a unique class of molecules. There's other classes that are also available to treat Crohn's disease, but that's the only one that is available to treat multiple sclerosis. Further down, fingolimod, siponimod, ozanimod, ponesimod, all the same family, so-called sphingosine 1 phosphate modulators. And I'll show you those in a second. Ponesimod is not yet approved, but will presumably be approved in the next year or two. Teriflunomide and with it leflunomide are noted below that. This is an example of a different type of molecule. Both are, one is a prodrug, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It actually becomes the other drug, and the other drug is the effective molecule. But this inhibits an enzyme that then alters the function of lymphocytes. The two fumarates, dimethyl fumarate, Tecfidera, and diroximel fumarate are noted. These don't really have a known mechanism of action. They have several mechanisms. They may or may not be related, but also represent two molecules that, when taken into your body, become a different molecule, monomethyl fumarate, which is the active ingredient. Alemtuzumab is actually a broad monoclonal antibody that affects multiple different lymphocytes and doesn't just simply block, as natalizumab does, but alemtuzumab, Lemtrada, actually removes or deletes cells. And this was the first molecule that actually deleted cells in such a way, as opposed to just blocking the function as natalizumab does. Shortly following that then also was ocrelizumab, which was preceded by rituximab, but rituximab was never approved for the use of multiple sclerosis. Genentech elected to go forward with ocrelizumab, a slightly different, more humanized molecule. That is, the business end of the ocrelizumab monoclonal antibody is actually made from this is a protein, and it's made from the DNA of a human as opposed to a mouse. And that slight difference there might have slight impacts on, for example, development of antibodies against the drug. They work very similarly. And then in addition, noted there is Truxima. Truxima is a biosimilar of rituximab. So ocrelizumab is approved for multiple sclerosis. Rituximab is not approved, but is used broadly with patients with multiple sclerosis and other autoimmune nervous system diseases. Truxima is a biosimilar. And then also noted there is ofatumumab. Ofatumumab will hopefully be approved by the FDA very soon, perhaps as early as the summer, and is a very similar but slightly different molecule. And you'll notice in the rituximab, there's an X. In ocrelizumab, there is a Z. And then in ofatumumab, there is an M in the middle. And what that means is that rituximab is a mixture, a chimeric molecule made up of DNA from both mice and humans. The ocrelizumab is more humanized. The business end, where the molecule actually interacts with the molecule on the outside of the white blood cell, the B lymphocyte, is coming from human DNA. Ofatumumab is a completely humanized molecule, representing that all of the protein that is made for ofatumumab comes from human DNA. None of that comes from mouse DNA. So a lot of different concepts in there, and let's look at some examples of these. So with, this is the S1P, sphingosine 1 phosphate modulator family. And the four over on the left, fingolimod, siponimod, ozanimod, and ponesimod, represent those that are available. All of these molecules, in theory, could interact with one of 5 sets of receptors around the body in different organs. And because of the nature of the chemical interactions, all of them interact with receptor number 1. Let's see if I can make this work here. Hang on one second. Receptor 1, that's noted here. But notably, fingolimod can interact with receptor 3, receptor 4, and receptor 5. But the others, siponimod and ozanimod, only interact with 1 and 5, and ponesimod only interacts with number 1. What does this mean? It probably will not have a big impact in terms of how the medications work, because all of them will interact with both lymphocytes, neural cells, endothelial cells, and other cells around the body. It's felt that most likely the two most important cells are the lymphocytes, because blockade of interacting with this receptor blocks lymphocytes, white blood cells, from leaving the lymph nodes. That is one potential mechanism of action. But in addition, there are neural cells, astrocytes especially, upon which these drugs, which get into the nervous system, may interact directly with the astrocytes. And that can occur with any of these molecules. What you get when you don't have interactions with these other potential receptors with receptor 3 or receptor 4, for example, is that you have less potential interaction and side effects, perhaps, because you have less interaction at those sites. And then similarly for 5, recognize that ponesimod also does not interact with receptor 5. So what these represent is very similar but slightly different molecules that have probably the same general mechanism of action, the same outcomes, but perhaps less side effects and slightly different variations on a theme in terms of their overall effects. In addition, they're slightly taken differently. They're all taken orally, but siponimod does not require, nor does ozanimod require a first dose observation, as is noted for fingolimod, Gilenya, because fingolimod has a very profound effect on the heart with a drop in heart rate and blood pressure. And with the development of the newer drugs, they have gotten around this by simply having a ramp up in the dose slowly over time, as opposed to starting at the maximum dose right away. And this would mean that you don't have to use a first dose observation day, as is typically used for Gilenya. So this is an example of a drug class with many different molecules available and with slightly different impacts with the different medications. This is the first of the monoclonal antibodies that was used to treat multiple sclerosis, also available and approved to treat Crohn's disease, an autoimmune disease of the gut. And this is the basic outline of a monoclonal antibody, or any antibody. But the monoclonal antibodies that we're talking about are made in the laboratory, as opposed to the antibodies that our normal immune system makes. They share a similar structure, and you can see the so-called CDRs, or complementary determining regions. Those are the regions that interact with molecules on the outside of cells, or actually interact with molecules themselves, and either block, in the case of natalizumab Tysabri, or actually may destroy and remove certain cells, as in the case of alemtuzumab, rituximab, ocrelizumab, and ofatumumab. And so this particular monoclonal antibody is directed against the alpha-4 integrin. That is, it binds to that, and as I'll show you on the next slide, in this case, you can see the alpha-4 integrin on the left, which is sitting on the bottom of the leukocyte there. The leukocyte is a white blood cell. And the natalizumab, the Tysabri, interacts with that, blocks that function. And as opposed to that white blood cell being allowed to then go through into the tissue, into the brain or the spine or the gut in the case of Crohn's disease, which it would normally do and then set up shop and cause the problems that we think of as MS, it's blocked and it's not allowed entry into the nervous system. In the case of the other monoclonal antibodies, they not only bind to the different molecules, in the case of the rituximab, ocrelizumab, and ofatumumab, the so-called CD20 molecule on the outside of the white blood cell, or the CD52 molecule for alemtuzumab, Lemtrado, they also then delete that molecule. Those cells are destroyed and removed. That is not the case with natalizumab. And that's a very important distinction, because natalizumab those molecules of natalizumab will simply fall off over time, and then those cells would still be available. And that's why we have to continue to retreat with the natalizumab Tysabri more frequently. And it also is related to the fact that when we stop using the medication, is potentially a risk that you would see return of disease activity, maybe even a rebound of disease activity that is relatively unique to natalizumab, and then also perhaps Gilenya fingolimod and the other family members related to fingolimod. In that case, presumably it's because the lymphocytes that have been blocked inside the lymph node now can be released suddenly. So the subtle differences between the different monoclonal antibodies may lead to different outcomes with regard to impacts when you stop using the medication. When I was in training, the theory was that the T lymphocyte, one class of white blood cells, was the most important in terms of the disease process with multiple sclerosis, and many therapies were potentially directed at T lymphocytes. But there are other classes of lymphocytes, white blood cells, including the B lymphocytes, and they're pictured here. And the B lymphocytes, as it turns out, perhaps have a much larger role in causing multiple sclerosis and all the related problems. And you can see that, like every other stem cell in the body, if you follow from on the left, from the stem cell all the way up through plasma cells, the long-lived plasma cells, you can see that there's a development of these cells over time. And they will express on their surface these different time frames of the B cell development. Will have different markers on their surface, proteins that stick out of the surface of the cell. And these will be available on the outside of the cell at different times in the development of these B cells as they become so-called plasma cells, which actually make the normal antibodies that our body uses all the time to fight off infection. And this gives an opportunity for us, from a laboratory point of view, to develop molecules that will actually interact with these surface molecules, the CD19, CD20, CD52, VLA4, BAFF-R, and CD138. And these molecules are now targets where you can develop a monoclonal antibody that will attach to either the CD19, 20, et cetera, and then presumably be able to remove that particular class of cells. And you can see that there's a molecule that's being studied now for neuromyelitis optica and showed quite a good benefit for that. This anti-CD19 from MedImmune is noted. The CD20 molecules are rituximab, ocrelizumab, ofatumumab, and there's a fourth, ublituximab, that's also being studied in MS, et cetera. And alemtuzumab is the anti-CD52. CD52s are also noted on these outside of these white blood cells, the B lymphocytes. So these markers on the outside of the white blood cells become targets, and you can see that they will delete. If you delete those that are expressed at different time frames, you'll delete different cells within the pattern of the development of these cells over time. Ultimately, the long-lived plasma cells make antibodies, but the earlier cells, the immature B cells, the mature activated B cells, the memory B cells, they may do a variety of other things different from development of antibodies, having to do with the regulation of the immune system, even long before the immune cells, the plasma cells make the antibodies. So this is suggesting there are multiple different targets, multiple different ways you might remove the cells that would have a potential positive impact on treating MS. So switching gears, we now have in our armamentarium a number of different drugs that are no longer made just by one company, but are made by multiple companies and are generics, that is knockoffs, if you will. And these are copies that one company makes of a brand name drug. So the first of these was Copaxone, glatiramer acetate is the generic name. And they're developed by a different company after the patent has expired. There's patent protection, which is allowed in many countries in the world, and protect the investment of the pharmaceutical companies that have made whatever drug that is. In this case, we're talking about Copaxone first. They have the same active ingredients, in this case, glatiramer acetate, and work the same way with the same risks and benefits. They're equivalent in dosage, safety, strength, route of administration, quality, and performance characteristics, and are required by the FDA to prove chemical equivalence. The inactive ingredients, for example, if it's in a pill, there are always some inactive ingredients, that binders and other things that hold a pill together, and those have to be acceptable, although not necessarily identical. They have the same label as the brand name medication. That is, if there's an approval for relapsing remitting MS, you get the exact same approval for relapsing remitting MS. The drug also has to be made consistently. The company has to prove that they have the factory capacity to make it consistently. But the FDA does not require that there are trials, clinical trials, to prove effectiveness. It is assumed that if they are chemically equivalent, then they would be effectively equivalent as well. The important other aspect of this is financial. Generally, 40 to 50% of cost savings versus a brand name. And this is broadly across many different categories of different drugs. It may be different for one drug compared to another. And in our field, unfortunately, the savings have not been anywhere near that high. So there are now 2 generic drugs, one made by Sandoz, which is a subsidiary of Novartis, and one made by Mylan. The Mylan product is simply called glatiramer acetate, and the Sandoz product is called Glatopa. And so there are the 2 examples, Glatopa and glatiramer acetate, and they have increasing use in MS, and the insurance companies, because they are a little bit cheaper, oftentimes prefer to use these. If you feel that you really need to or wish to continue to use Copaxone, you can, of course, ask your physician to, when they write their prescription, to write into, when they sign it, to mark dispense as written, because that suggests that you would really want them to continue to use that drug. That may or may not be available with the insurance company over time. Some are pushing more generics, and that will be an issue going forward. Now with fingolimod, Gilenya is the original trade name for that, made by Novartis. But now, last December, on the same day, the FDA approved 3 different generics from Sun Pharmaceutical, HEC Pharm, and Biocon to be also used as fingolimod agents. They haven't really made it much into the market. I think they came later in the year. The insurance companies didn't have an opportunity to react to that before they made their formularies for the January change when people turn over their insurance. This may occur coming in July. It may occur coming in next January in 2021. But again, this is a pill now, not a shot like Copaxone, and it is chemically equivalent to fingolimod. So it'll be interesting to see for this family, we not only have now 3 different drugs, fingolimod, siponimod, and ozanimod, but we also have 3 generics for fingolimod, so 6 different molecules all in the same class. And how this goes forward in terms of how people functionally use these medications will be very interesting to see. It should be noted as well that with siponimod, and subsequently to all other drugs that have been approved for MS since then, the FDA has approved all of the medications for relapsing forms of MS to include the first attack of MS, or clinically isolated syndrome, run-of-the-mill routine relapsing remitting MS, as well as secondary progressive MS with activity, meaning that the expectation is if you have slow worsening, so-called progressive MS, that you've at least at some point in the recent past, within the last year or 2, had a new scan change or a relapse superimposed on top of that slow progression. And all subsequent molecules that would be approved for relapsing MS will include all 3 of those categories, whereas the older molecules really just said relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, and unless there was a specific indication for clinically isolated syndrome, did not include that at all. And until siponimod came on the market, that was the first that was approved for so-called secondary progressive MS. So now also the way the medicines are approved by the FDA has slightly expanded with siponimod last year in 2019. So what's a biosimilar? Is that just another name for a generic? No, it's really not. Biosimilars are slightly different. They are not identical chemically to a different molecule, but they are highly similar is the term that is used. They are modeled after a biological drug. Well, what's a biological drug? It's not a chemical. Aspirin is a chemical. It's acetyl salicylic acid. Fingolimod is just a molecule. But biological drugs are actually different. They use living organisms, yeast, bacteria, animal or plant cells, as important ingredients. So, for example, if you want to make a monoclonal antibody, you actually put together the molecule that looks like an antibody that your normal immune system makes. And you also then make that inside of living cells, either bacteria or more commonly, you would make it inside of a mammalian cell. Similarly, you make the interferons inside a so-called prokaryotic cell like a yeast, a prokaryotic cell like a bacteria, and beta-seron is made in bacteria, but all of the other interferons and copaxone are actually made inside of mammalian cells. And then in order to get the molecule out of the cell, you crack the cell open, you get rid of all the debris, and then you have the chemical that you're looking for, the molecule you're looking for. When you want to make a large complex molecule, as opposed to just a chemical, this is the way you essentially grow or make the molecule that you want. In this case, approval requires that it not only be highly similar, but it contains no meaningful clinical differences. And this then does require that there's more clinical testing that is done. In our world, Truxima is a biosimilar of rituximab. And in fact, patients who have been treated at Kaiser may know and may be using Truxima because they have been using that. The price savings here is not generally as high as it is with the use of generics because it's a little bit more complicated and there's more testing involved. But there's still price savings generally compared to the brand name. And in this case, the brand name is rituximab and Truxima is the biosimilar. In addition, around the world, biosimilars are used quite frequently, sometimes with and sometimes without the patent having been expired. In the United States, that would be more problematic because of the patent and the protection of the patent. So do we have examples of biologics in our world? Sure, all of the interferons, the monoclonal antibodies as noted, and then Truxima is a biosimilar, as I just mentioned a moment ago. And so we do see a variety of biologicals that are used in our world, and we'll presumably see more of these going forward as opposed to simple chemicals that we might see, like Tecfidera or Vumerity. Those are both just chemicals as well. What about prodrugs? Well, a drug is simply a substance that is used to treat an illness, relieve a symptom, or modify a chemical process in the body for a specific purpose. A prodrug is a drug that is administered in an inactive form, or maybe a partially active form, that is metabolized in the body into a biologically active compound. So you may take a chemical into your body that is then metabolized by your body in your stomach, in your gut, other parts of your body, your liver, and then it becomes the active ingredient. And we know, for example, in our world, that dimethyl fumarate, Tecfidera, diroximel fumarate, Vumerity, both of those get metabolized into monomethyl fumarate, and that is the most active ingredient in treating multiple sclerosis, and similar molecule called Fumiderm, which is used primarily in Germany to treat psoriasis. It's not exactly the same, but it's another variation of the fumaric acids, the fumarates. The advantage potentially for Vumerity is that Vumerity was directly compared head-to-head with Tecfidera, and although it has the same monomethyl fumarate, that's the active ingredient, it had less GI tract side effects, reduced by anywhere from 30 to 50% or so. And that's because the starting molecule, dimethyl fumarate or diroximel fumarate, was actually slightly different. So there are less GI tract side effects, and that's exactly why it was developed, to avoid some of those side effects. In addition, leflunomide, or Arava, is used in rheumatoid arthritis all the time. It's a commonly used drug. It gets metabolized into teriflunomide, Aubagio. Aubagio is a medicine that's approved for a variety of things, but most recently was approved for multiple sclerosis several years ago and is used significantly around the world. And so leflunomide can be thought of as a prodrug for teriflunomide. And in theory, you would have the same impact, although maybe the drug dosages and whatnot would be different. And Arava has never been studied in multiple sclerosis to my knowledge, but likely you could use Arava, which is much cheaper than Aubagio is. It'd be interesting to see going forward if there's more focus on trying to reduce costs, if someone perhaps does a study of Arava with multiple sclerosis patients. But I've not seen that. I've not heard of one being planned at any time, maybe in the future. So the potential advantages of the newer disease-modifying therapies that we are talking about. So ofatumumab is a potential, maybe to be approved shortly, drug in the anti-CD20 class, similar to rituximab and ocrelizumab. It is taken as a subcutaneous injection at home. That is, there's no infusion reactions. If there's no infusion, there might be a slight reaction with the actual injection. It may have slightly different effects on lymph nodes and might have different side effects or even outcomes over time. But the biggest difference will be that it'll be taken differently and will not require an infusion having to go anywhere. Diroximel fumarate, as I mentioned, has less GI tract side effects than dimethyl fumarate, Tecfidera. Fingolimod and glatiramer acetate generics are potentially cheaper than their proprietary namesakes. And leflunomide, as a prodrug, could also be potentially cheaper than Aubagio. So these are potential advantages of either new disease-modifying therapies or those that might be used separately off-label, such as Arava, that might have similar outcomes but have different advantages. So the main points I hopefully stress today, that we are blessed with many, many different disease-modifying therapy options. And in the 27 years since beta-serin was approved, we now have over 20 different options, including biosimilars, generics, different doses, and different variations within the same class of medications. We still, of course, require balancing of efficacy, the effectiveness, and the risk of the medication versus the risk of the disease process itself in every individual, and taking into account patient preferences. All of those things will allow us to come up with the best approach for choosing a disease-modifying therapy that's individualized for that one person. Of all the new drugs, most are variations in classes or generics, which might offer some advantages over other older disease-modifying therapies. But there are other classes of medications also being studied right now, including the so-called BTK class and others that might have different impacts, as well as different molecules that are looking at regeneration, remyelination, and other things that are completely separate and have nothing to do with altering the immune system at all. And then finally, costs remain a serious problem. The whole reason that generics are coming into our market is because the costs are very high, and it's viewed as potentially a market where a generic drug maker can actually make money. How will these more generics, biosimilars, change the utilization of medications in our world? Not really clear yet, and I think it'll evolve over the course of the next several years. So thank you very much for your attention. Please, everyone, stay safe. We hope that you have a very profitable and welcoming spring and summer. And we hope to see you in the fall for our next Ed Summit as well. Thank you very much, and have a great week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Corboy. We will now have a 3-minute break. If you need more than 3 minutes for a break, you can press the pause button on YouTube. The video will resume where you left off whenever you press play. Please remember that you can submit questions for the Q&A session by asking in the comments section or emailing them to education@mscenter.org. We'll record the answers and share them via social media over the next week. And don't forget to visit the virtual exhibit hall. Welcome back. Our next presenter is Dr. Jeff Hebert. Dr. Hebert is a physical therapist by training, with extensive education and experience related to treating MS patients. His clinical and research expertise includes examining, treating, and investigating balance, fall risk, mobility, fatigue, and other related symptomatic outcomes, muscle and brain function, and the efficacy and effectiveness of exercise approaches in patients with neurological diagnosis, with a primary focus on patients with MS. Today, he'll be talking about exercising and fatigue.
Well, welcome everybody to our talk on exercise and fatigue and MS. And I just want to say thank you for all the organizers of this talk, the Rocky Mountain MS Center, Kelsey and Peter. Thank you so much for helping in today's presentation. And then everybody out there that's going to be viewing this, and hopefully you get a lot of information that, if it's a lot of confirmation of what you're already doing, that's fantastic. However, some of this might be new and or supporting, what you already are doing, or what you've heard out there from clinicians or from, YouTube or, videos that you've seen, or going to Google. Hopefully we can consolidate this in a fairly short period of time and very knowledgeable information. So it is my pleasure to begin the talk. So from my over 20 years experience working with people with MS and working with the Rocky Mountain MS Center since that time, I'm hoping to bring you a fair amount of information that I've gleaned, that I've learned from patients just like you, and from my colleagues, and then also from my experience in research as well. I do not have any professional disclosures at this time related to this presentation. And also, I just want to say the only disclaimer is that I do have a bias that this is something that I feel is extremely important. So I am biased that everything I say is fantastic in this realm of exercise in MS. First of all, everything that I'm going to suggest are guidelines, but the very first thing you want to do before you start, initiating a new exercise or exercising at all, you want to consult with your primary care practitioner for your general medical health, and then also your primary MS practitioner to make sure that with MS, you are safe to exercise in the realm that is suggested. And then also, as you start, it would be the best situation if you were able to initiate under supervision and guidance from an exercise professional, and optimally, those individuals that have history of working with people with neurological related conditions, especially MS, because there are some idiosyncrasies that go along with exercise in MS. So the one thing that we know that as of yet, we do not have a cure for MS, and that is as yet. So then obviously there's progression of the disease, and with that becomes disability. So there's three main areas that I feel are the reasons for the progressive disability in MS. Obviously the ongoing disease activity itself, but being under the supervised care of skilled MS frontline providers, you are to have their best disease-modifying therapies and drug-related care, thus ceasing as much of the activity in that disease activity as possible. But then the other two are something that could be added to the list of why there's progressive disability in people with MS. The last one there is age-related loss of function. As long as you're living and you're going through years and decades of your life, we all on this planet are going through changes in our neurological system, and if left alone, are going to result in advanced disability as it relates to age. And then that one in the middle is the one that we're going to focus on primarily in this talk, of course, is the disuse and deconditioning aspect. And this is starting to become known as a possible significant contributing factor to the onset of progressive disability in people with MS. Sedentary activity, it is no surprise that human beings, and unfortunately those that reside in the United States, are significantly inactive. And thus, I know that we're currently going through a viral pandemic, but sedentary behavior has been a pandemic and especially an epidemic in this country. And it should be something that we focus on as a disease itself. And unfortunately, historically and continued, people with MS are more sedentary and less physically active for multiple reasons. And there are barriers to engage in physical activity. And hopefully we can go over some of those areas that we can maybe help with the barriers to engage in exercise on a more regular basis, because it is extremely important. If we go back to the most seminal article out there, it goes way back to 1996. The late Dr. Pettijohn did a first study of exercise, primarily aerobic exercise, in people with MS. It is the first documented, peer-reviewed article and study that showed that it is acceptable, feasible, and effective for people with MS. So we're not talking about just yesterday's news. We're talking about over a couple decades of knowledge, but we are still at times spinning our wheels. I thought I'd be just a little bit more whimsical and create my own little graphs. And so I got out some graph paper and put my thoughts down. So if I were to be more dynamic, I'd be showing this to you as a group in real life time. But we'll go ahead and start with the graph in stationary time. So what we have on the axis on the left is health level, so the level of health or health status. And then the continuum on the bottom is health span. It's sort of a somewhat new term instead of lifespan, knowing that we have a certain lifespan and all of us have termination of that at some given time. And hopefully that's down the road. But there's also a concept of being more healthy during that lifespan. So I'm going to flip it around and use this new term of health span. And so in general, there's a red line there, and I've got the arrow there that shows over time, you start at a certain higher level of health status. And then over time, when you are not engaging in anything that really is to augment or improve your health over time, with multiple sclerosis especially, there's going to be a reduction of your health span and also possibly your lifespan. So we're going to start with that first diagram of left alone, doing absolutely nothing to increase your health or your physical and or even mental health. You're going to have a downward spiral effect. So the recommendations come from multiple sources, and this is where it can be confusing, because when you look at a number of 150 minutes per week of activity coming down to about 30 to 60 minutes per day, it can feel, especially if you have not engaged in physical activity and exercise as of yet, that's a daunting number. And there's a resource that has indicated that exercise is medicine. So to understand that how to engage in exercise, how to improve your physical activity and then your health, it is a prescription, just like a drug. So we have to understand that it should be taken serious, and it should be thought of as more of a long-term medical condition that needs to be treated as such, like a drug that is a long-term drug that is taken for a long period of time, but is based on a dosage. And in exercise, there's different doses that we're going to talk about in the next slides. But important is that it is just as if it were be something that you would take as a drug. And modes of exercise can be free living physical activity. However, one thing that stands in the way usually, and number one symptom, as everybody pretty much knows, is fatigue. So symptomatic fatigue is upwards about 85% of people with MS have symptomatic fatigue, and that's lethargy. That is just, I can't get my rear end off the couch and I just cannot move. I really cannot get myself motivated to go. So there could be a psychological, mental, and emotional aspect to it. And there's also a performance fatigability that I'm going to focus on more, but to know that fatigue that is more of a symptom and a feeling, a perception of fatigue can also be something that's improved with physical activity and should be understood that it is also a hurdle. But I'm going to go through more so of the performance fatigue to show you sort of how I put it into more of a flow of what it looks like for a person with MS that attempts to just be a little bit more physically active. This might be as you're ambulatory, you're thinking, I'm going to walk for exercise. I don't need fancy equipment. I'm going to start to walk more. And that's a good start of an exercise program or just being more physically active, is that you start to feel that your muscles are starting to become more fatigued as you do more. So this is a continuum from left to right. As a person with MS begins to walk, so far everything starts to play out pretty well. So you start walking, and here we have a green line and we have a red line. Red line is the muscle fatigue that occurs, and then the opposite over time as you start to walk. Let's say this is from you start to walk to about maybe 5-10 minutes into the walk. And all of a sudden you start to feel like let's say your right foot starts to slap a little bit more, or you feel like that right foot starts to drag a little bit more. That red line starts to go up. So you start to get more fatigue in that leg. But then what happens is that your performance starts to go down. That might be your walking speed goes down, your balance gets worse. So there's an inverse relationship, increased muscle fatigue, poor performance. So as you get a bigger spread in that, and you have a bigger delta between that, then you're going to have the inability to come back to baseline. So the longer you wait to rest, it's going to take you longer to get back to where you were with your muscles not as fatigued and your performance not as hindered. And that's what that drawn out lines are. And eventually you will come back down to where you recovered. However, if you start to introduce more rest periods, so before this delta becomes even bigger here, you insert a rest, maybe a minute and a half, not very long, let the muscles relax a little bit, and then move on and start to walk again. You will reduce the amount of recovery time and the reduction of performance. And as a result, the more you do that, you can then gain ability to not have the split happen so early on in your walking. That means that your muscles are becoming more conditioned. But as a person with MS, it's a bit of a phenomenon that it's like, well, in 5, 10, 15 minutes, my MS didn't get worse. So why is my right leg starting to fatigue out? Well, it's that you have premature fatigability in your muscles, but you also can gain endurance and strength as long as you abide by making sure you do not bring your muscles to failure. As soon as you start to have more of a foot drop, a foot drag, or any other muscles that start to fail, it's already indicating that you're giving failure to that muscle, and it's going to have a harder time to recover and come back down to baseline. And thus, having more breaks that are shorter periods during your walking, you're going to improve your performance and decrease the adverse effect of muscle fatigue and gain health by being more physically active. So just by being more physically active, can be extremely improving your health, because what the new adage out there now is that sitting is the new smoking. So the new rule is that about 20, 30 minutes of static sitting is okay, but you need to get up and move around a little bit. So if you have 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours of continuous inactivity, your health degrades during that time. But if you split up and just think about not maybe gaining more activity, but what about just reducing the amount of sedentary, sitting still and not moving? However, even if you're in a wheelchair, you have inability to walk, what about moving arms, moving your trunk, rotating your trunk? Moving any part of your body is physical activity. So if you're non-ambulatory, just move whatever limbs you can to get more physical activity during that time and abide by these same rules. You're going to gain health over time. So the blue line indicates that if you start to improve your activity, you are pushing up your health status line. And so then you have the positive delta that you want is that original red line that you aren't doing a darn thing about your health as far as physical activity wise, but you started to engage in more physical activity. So early on, when that split started happening and you're improving your overall activity, those purple lines are indicators of a positive lift of your physical or your health status during improving your health span at the same time of probably improving your lifespan as well. So health benefits. So, the organs is what we like to call them, the heart, the lungs, even our skin is an organ. And physical activity, exercise, definitely helps in preventative heart disease, pulmonary lung disease, and other conditions like diabetes that are obviously preventable. So certain organs can benefit from more physical activity. So as a person with MS, you are a person. So you are going to benefit health-wise completely separate from MS, just like any human being would. But also just like any human being, we would like to have better brain health. So that is an extremely important organ. And there are models that are being created in neurological conditions, even such as Alzheimer's, dementia, and now currently we're starting to build in more in MS, of a direct link between heart health and brain health. And one way that our brain gets more healthy is through physical activity. And when exercising the heart on a more regular basis, you release a protein, which I like to call the fertilizer for the brain, which the fancy term, and we'll just abbreviate it, is BDNF. So they are neurotrophic factors that allow your brain to be protected, to be healthier, and could be seen as possibly a disease modifier for MS as well. So other, symptom-wise, the benefits that are increasing good outcomes, quality of life, vitality, self-esteem, and decreasing bad symptoms of fatigue and depression. So it's a really nice realm to have better health, but also a better mood along with that. So I've been using this slide and the study by Dr. White from over a decade now. And the benefits of exercise in MS is not just me spilling it out as, well, what I recommend, but the experts in the field of MS and research and clinical care, knowing that the benefits of and the roles of exercise, again, can enhance other factors like functional activity and reduce, again, like I said, fatigue and depression, but then also the brain health. And the really interesting term there is neurogenesis. So neurogenesis is the ability of the neurological system to actually gain new cells. So that's a really interesting concept of pushing back against the age-related and disease-related reduction of brain cells and neurological cells centrally in the body, and thus you can actually improve your brain health by replacing some of the cells that have been lost. So that's a really hot area of research right now, a little bit more in animal research, but moving into the human research as well. And then as it relates to MS, more specifically about the anti and pro-inflammatory, but enhancing those that are more damaging to the brain and to the body, and then also reducing those that actually can help then open up the gates to more healthy brain and neurological system, and then obviously leading to decreasing disability level. And the bottom line indicator, I think in all of us, is if I can have a better quality of life to the last day I have on this earth, I think that's the biggest goal for us. And exercise can enhance that. So borrowing from our neighbors up north, it's a pretty straightforward, a little bit more condensed than the previous slide that showed 150 minutes, blah, 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 per week, that it comes down to about 30 minutes of moderate intensity of aerobic exercise, about 2 times per week, in strength training about 2 times per week as well. And we'll get into a little bit more specifics on what I recommend, and it looks beyond this because it's a pretty superficial recommendation. But again, it's a recommendation for people specifically with MS. So the green line. So the green line is what could happen if you engage in more purposeful, maybe more organized, and more progressive exercise program. So as you add on beyond starting with just generally decreasing the amount of sedentary sitting or lack of movement activity during the day by moving around the house, around the neighborhood, however, increasing to the point where you're adding exercise to it, you can push your health status up and then increasing your health span and probably also your lifespan along with that. So again, you're pushing it up, you're pushing it up, you're pushing it up, but it takes you to be the champion of that with some guidance from professionals. So endurance training, exercise that is related to targeting the heart and the lungs, and the modes could be walking, running, cycling, and others could be moving your arms. If your legs are not working to the point where you cannot walk, you can move your trunk. If you move and rotate your trunk more than just sitting there, sit away from the back of the chair and lift your arms, rotate your head, you're probably going to see that your heart rate actually goes up. As long as your heart rate goes up from the time when you're sitting still to the time that you're moving your body for even just 30 seconds, you have done something to improve your health and your health span. So being purposeful about it is extremely important. So the intensity is somewhat hard, and the effort is something that could be monitored by heart rate. But sometimes you might need to have a screening by a professional that determines if your heart rate is a viable or valid indicator of intensity. Because with some people with MS, the autonomic nervous system that automatically regulates heart rate in response to exercise could be hindered and not give you accurate information. So you might have to think about it. How does it feel? Does it feel somewhat hard while I'm doing this? Is it harder than just sitting still? I think that's a good start. Duration, your target. Now, this is the daunting number right here. 30 to 45 minutes. It's like, are you kidding me? You want me to start with 30 minutes? No, this is your target to get to. So it might be 3 minutes. It might be 2 minutes. It might be 5 minutes. And you do that on a regular basis. You chip away at it. You chip away at it. This is a marathon as far as changing your behavior. or adjusting your behavior. This is not a sprint. So do not get frustrated with, well, there's no way in heck I'm going to be able to do 30 minutes, so I'm not going to do it. That is what goes wrong with people suggesting these numbers. But this is where maybe in a year, maybe in 2 years, you have your ability to get to 30 minutes of exercise per day. As long as you're reducing your sedentary sitting still, not moving any limb whatsoever, and you're starting to reduce that number, adding more physical activity, you're on a great start. And then intervals, again, as I played out in that first diagram of walking and how your muscles can get fatigued if you continue and continue and continue, the interval would be to stop. So for this, it might be that you do 1 or 2 minutes of getting your heart rate up and rest for 30 seconds. Then 1 to 2 minutes and then rest for 30 seconds. And then again, and you go on. Your goal then is to get to where you could do 5 minutes at a time, then rest, then 10 minutes. Now we're talking months and maybe years until you get to the point where you're doing continuously 30 to 45 minutes per day. And the frequency, 2 days a week to could be 7 days a week. Yes, forever. So the other way that, again, that somewhat hard area could be a scale that Dr. Borg back in 1998 thought he would really kind of mess with the American mind and not make a scale that's 0 to 10, like we always like. And he created a 6 to 20 scale. So we'll go with it. As long as we understand that if you are moving more than sitting and you can get yourself to where you feel like you're from a 6 to about a 9 initially, then you can get yourself to a 12. You're in that realm of being able to have the benefits of physical activity, especially on your brain. Strength training, as your muscles become weaker, possibly with MS, and then also with age. So there's what's called sarcopenia. And that's what every human being goes through at some given point in their life. And it actually starts at the late second decade of our life as we start to reduce muscle mass and muscle strength. And yes, if you don't do anything about it, you're going to get weaker. So you have to do something purposeful as a human being to improve your muscle. And this is for males, females, does not matter. Muscle function, muscle strength, and some mass as well. And then on top of that is that MS, as you know, is something that weakens the muscle even more. So arms, legs, core, which is trunk, which would be the abdominals, the lower back, the upper back. Stationary machines can be very beneficial for safety if you have access to them. Hand weights, cuff weights, anything like that can be very beneficial. And again, the intensity is somewhat hard effort. And I termed the concept of feel and look. So your last repetition, so you might only do 1 repetition. So when you look down there at duration of 1 set to 2 set, of one set or a set is made up of repetitions. So even if you're starting off with just 1 set, 1 rep, that's okay. And it's going to give you benefit because the rule of thumb is if you can move through the full range of, let's say, you're lifting a weight with your hand and your elbow is bending and you're doing what's called a bicep curl, that as you're coming up, you want to move through that full range of motion that you established the first time. It feels more effortful on that last repetition. Let's say you're doing 2 or 3 repetitions. Your third repetition should feel like, wow, that was harder, noticeably harder than the first one. However, it looked as good as the first one. So it moved through the full range of motion. So when doing strength training, make sure you are not bringing your muscles to fatigue. That is an extreme misnomer when exercising for strength, especially with people with MS. And I think that was where we started to get down the wrong road several decades ago, that it was actually stated that don't exercise because your muscles get too fatigued. You're getting worse. Yes, well, then doing it worse gets you worse. So let's do it better in making sure that you have success with your exercise repetitions, whatever muscles that you're focusing on, and making sure that you have the time to build up to 1 to 2 sets and no more than 20 repetitions for that. Then you start to add on more weight and you bring down your repetitions. And this is where a little bit of guidance from a skilled exercise specialist could help. And you don't need that on a daily basis, maybe, but maybe on a quarterly and or yearly basis to make sure that you're on the right track of doing the right thing for progressing your exercise program. And again, 2 to 7 days per week forever. And if you wanted to work certain muscles that you feel are more beneficial for ambulation, could be the trunk, and then also the muscles of the legs that you feel are weaker because of MS. Just know that you can exercise the stronger leg, let's say, as much as it can, but the other leg that might be weaker, you exercise it maybe differently, exercise it differently to a certain level. It's still going to get the benefit, but do not try to have it match the stronger leg and really overwork it. Again, another route that you don't want to go down. So you might have to exercise your limbs differently because of the phenomenon of MS, to where it might be your right leg and your left arm that are the ones that are weaker. And it's something that's pretty common. So knowing that, yes, you have probably a pair of arms and a pair of legs, and however, they might not function the same. So exercise them possibly differently. And I'd like to share these slides, which I have now for years, because it shows, I think everybody kind of knows what the EDSS is. It's a standard disability scale that's heavily weighted in ambulation, specifically for people with MS. So it comes from the neurological exam. A higher score. So on this one, when you go up to EDSS of 9, which is the lighter gray individuals, that they had one person in this group that did exercise specifically to improve arm strength, and those compared to other disability levels that were more moderate. And then on the top there in the more solid line is less disabled individuals with MS, or more functional, let's say. So as they exercised over 3 months, that's the bottom line down there, they started exercise from the left at baseline, 3 months of exercising for strength training, 6 months out, a continued trend of improving strength, which is the resistance of pounds on the left from 15 to 40, they were able to have improved strength over time. The really cool thing about this one is if you look at the two groups that were moderate and then also more severe disability, is that they basically, with effort over 6 months of period of time, they were at where a person with less disability with MS that did not start exercising yet, they got to the level of their baseline. And then if we look at leg strength, same trend. It almost looks exactly the same as upper extremity strengthening, lower extremity strengthening. Leg extension is straightening your leg out at the knee. So what's said there is that looks like sort of reversing disability in people with MS. So I'd like to share that slide, these two slides that show it is possible not only to gain strength, but it's able to be gained in individuals that historically have been thought of, well, you have such a high level of disability in MS, you cannot gain any benefit from exercise. And this slide, amongst other slides and other diagrams, have shown that with people with MS, strength, endurance, and health in reduction of disability can be had, but it takes purposeful and guided behavioral change or enhancement of your behavior in a more physically active and exercise-filled life. So this is a picture of Cancun, which we were going to go this year, but we can't, but that's okay. But, it's, kind of a horizon, and it's a span of our future. If we just take a hold of it, that we can move forward and we can feel good about ourselves if we do something that we know is going to be beneficial. And that would be in this talk specifically about exercise and physical activity and how it affects your body, preventative diseases, and improving your brain health. And yes, the potential to reduce disability if you have gained disability due to MS. I just want to thank you for your time, and I hope that I receive some questions that I can respond to in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hebert. The best way to submit questions for the presenters is to fill out our evaluation, which is linked in the video description and will be emailed to all registrants. We take your feedback on the evaluations very seriously and would love to hear from you. Next, please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Gross. Dr. Gross divides his time between patient care, teaching, and clinical research. His research interests include the identification of biomarkers associated with treatment responses in MS. Dr. Gross will be giving an update on disease-modifying therapies.
Hi there, I'm Rob Gross. I'm speaking for the Spring Education Summit for the Rocky Mountain MS Center. Today's topic will be updates on MS disease-modifying therapies. I don't have any relevant disclosures for today's talk. So this year has been, the past 12 months have been pretty exciting for the field of MS in terms of immunotherapies. We've seen the arrival of several new FDA-approved therapies for multiple sclerosis. There's been siponimod, which is also known as Mayzent, ozanimod, known as Zeposia, cladribine, the trade name is Mavenclad. And in addition, there's been the introduction of several generic versions of fingolimod. The trade name for that was originally Gilenya. As well as a new fumarate, diroximel fumarate, which goes by Vumerity. So a number of new therapeutic options in our armamentarium. You may notice that many of them are fairly similar to medicines that we have at the moment. So, for instance, siponimod and ozanimod are in the S1P receptor category, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But those are that's the same class of medication as fingolimod, which has been around since 2010. And in addition, diroximel fumarate is a fumarate like Tecfidera as well, which is expected to act in a similar way. Cladribine is a different type of medication that has actually been around in a different form, in an IV form previously, but just received FDA approval in an oral formulation. And it basically acts to reduce T and B lymphocytes in a way kind of like a chemotherapy. It's given in courses of several days and then spaced out by a month, and then there's another course a year later, and there's a cumulative amount that you can take because there's a risk for malignancy with that one. The others, siponimod, ozanimod, fingolimod, these are all once daily oral medications, and diroximel fumarate is a twice daily oral medication, like their predecessors in their respective classes. Moving on. Coming soon, we have additional medications that hopefully we'll see in the clinic, but are not yet FDA approved. So we have ponesimod, which is another S1P receptor blocker. And then we also have ofatumumab and ublituximab. These are anti-CD20 treatments, so anti-B cell treatments, which are like what we currently have in the form of Ocrevus or ocrelizumab, as well as off-label use of rituximab. One thing to note about these medicines is that ofatumumab will be given as a subcutaneous injection roughly once a month, whereas ublituximab is like rituximab and ocrelizumab, an IV infusion. And this is the timeline for MS disease-modifying therapies. From the beginning, 1993 is when we got our very first MS immunotherapy, and that was an interferon beta, beta-seron. And then over the years, we've gotten many more in various formulations, subcutaneous injections, IV therapies, and oral pills. And we've learned a lot about treating MS in that amount of time. I'll talk a little bit specifically about this class of S1P receptor blockers or modulators in multiple sclerosis. So again, these include fingolimod, ozanimod, ponesimod, and siponimod. Their S1P stands for sphingosine 1 phosphate receptors. These are actually receptors that are found all over the body. And there are different flavors of them. There's subtype 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We think the subtype 1 is probably the most important in terms of what we do. And those are found on lymphocytes. So one of the well-known characteristics of treatment with this class of medications is that it blocks the exit of lymphocytes from the peripheral lymph tissue. So that results in those lymphocytes being trapped in those tissues and unable to gain access to the blood and subsequently the brain. In addition, we think that these medicines have direct effects on the brain. They can accumulate in the brain and target different brain cell types, including neurons and astrocytes and oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are the cell type that produces the myelin, and astrocytes have a very important role in MS and recovery from MS. One thing to note also about this slide is that whereas fingolimod or Gilenya targets these different receptor subtypes 1, 3, 4, and 5, the newer S1P receptor modulators, ozanimod and siponimod and ponesimod, are more selective in the different receptors that they target. And so could that have a differential effect? Maybe, maybe not. These are the results from 2 relapsing studies of ozanimod, and they were compared to interferon beta 1A, 30 micrograms, which is Avonex. And as you can see, in both studies, ozanimod was superior to Avonex in terms of reducing the relapse rate. And this is pretty similar to what we would expect to see from a medication of this class. In fact, fingolimod had a very similar study several years ago, which produced similar results in terms of relapse rate reduction. One of the reasons we talk about where these medications work, which cell types, is that the idea being that we know that our medicines all have an effect on the immune system, either eliminating certain immune cells or blocking their entry into the nervous system or blocking trafficking in some way. But one of the reasons we talk about some medications like these S1P receptor modulators having direct effects on different nervous system cells is that perhaps they might have some benefit in terms of progression delaying, something that even with our most potent immunosuppressants, we don't necessarily accomplish in all cases. And so to remind you, these were 2 progressive studies, one with siponimod in secondary progressive MS on the left, and one with fingolimod in primary progressive on the right. Siponimod was shown to have a modest benefit in terms of delaying progression in secondary progressive MS, whereas fingolimod's study in primary progressive MS showed no benefit whatsoever. And so the question is, are these medications really doing something different? Is the more selectivity of siponimod with respect to these S1P receptors really the thing that made a difference here? Or is it rather that we're getting better at designing clinical trials for progressive MS and being able to show these relatively mild benefits? So the difference between these two trials, besides one being in secondary and the other being in primary progressive, is that the siponimod trial enrolled far more patients. So when you enroll more patients, you're better able to show a very small effect. And in addition, a good quarter of the patients in the secondary progressive trial had active MRIs at the time of their enrollment, whereas something like 13% in the fingolimod study did. And we think that having evidence of disease activity in the form of active MRIs is very tightly linked to whether you're going to respond to any of these immunotherapies or not. And certainly having a quarter of the patients have active MRIs is maybe different from what we normally see in a secondary progressive clinic population. We also saw results of ofatumumab study. Again, this is going to be the new anti-B cell treatment like rituximab and ocrelizumab, but instead of being IV, this is given through a subcutaneous injection. And what we see from these studies in relapsing MS is what we come to expect from anti-B cell treatment in this population, which is to say a very significant reduction in the relapse rate on the left, and on the right, a near complete shutdown of active MRI lesions with treatment. In addition to these medications that we already discussed based on mechanisms of action that we're already familiar with, there are hopefully in the near future, we'll see some different mechanisms among our disease-modifying therapies. So these two medications that I'll talk about briefly work on by inhibiting different tyrosine kinases. These are enzymes that have an important role in cell signaling. So the first medication, masitinib, I believe that is how you pronounce it, is produced by a company, AB Science, and works at the level of macrophages and mast cells. They just released a press release in February that said that they had demonstrated positive results in a combination of primary and secondary progressive trial. So I haven't seen the details of this, but I'd be interested and be on the lookout for more information from this. The next medication doesn't even have a name yet, but it is produced by Sanofi. And targeting a different tyrosine kinase, Bruton tyrosine kinase, or BTK, which works at the level of B cells as well as microglia. These are cells in the brain itself. They demonstrated a benefit in a relapsing MS study, and hopefully we will be working with them soon on further studies of this molecule in relapsing and progressive MS. It is not all good news, however. You may recall from a few years back, there was a study of high-dose biotin in progressive MS, in which it showed that there was a benefit compared to placebo, not just in terms of slowing progression, but actually suggesting that a small percentage of people actually improved compared to their baseline. This was back a few years ago. We then participated along with several other MS centers in this country to try to replicate in a clinical trial to try to replicate these findings. And unfortunately, the results turned out to be negative. The company that makes this high-dose biotin announced that the trial did not meet any of its primary or secondary endpoints. So if you're taking high-dose biotin currently for multiple sclerosis, you should probably stop. If you're taking a lower dose biotin for your hair and nails, then you can probably continue to do that. We do have one ongoing progressive trial that we're participating in, and it's for alpha lipoic acid at a high dose. And this is a randomized controlled trial, like many of our studies. And so half of the patients will receive placebo and the other half will receive the active medication. And our goal is to try to see whether this medication results in better endpoints, specifically based on walking and falling. So to be determined. I've had a lot of questions in recent months about metformin as a potential pro-myelination therapy. As far as I can tell, this is not based on any robust data in humans with MS, but rather based mostly on studies like these in mice, where you have on the left a study that showed that older mice who were given metformin had restoration of the ability of those cells, the oligodendrocytes, to produce myelin, like they produced myelin when they were younger. And on the right, you have a different mouse model of MS in which metformin was given to mice after they had been given lesions to suggest MS, and it showed some recovery from those lesions. So these are still very early studies, and we'll need to see more data in actual human beings with MS before we can say whether this has any room in among our treatments. So we still, even though we have over 15 medications for MS now, there's still not a general consensus around the country and around the world about how do we treat, which medications should we start with, which medications should we switch to, when should we discontinue. These are all open questions. And when we talk about MS treatment, we're generally talking about treatment over many years or even decades. We tend to favor a use of highly effective medication from the very beginning. And there have recently been some studies on large cohorts of MS patients from around the world that suggest that the way we are treating people is the right way, because when people are started very early in their disease course with highly effective treatment, they tend to go on to have less in the way of long-term disability and are less likely to convert to a progressive form of the disease. But in medical science, we believe that the highest form of evidence is gotten from randomized control studies. So there are 2 such randomized control studies ongoing around the country to try to evaluate the treatment strategies of either choosing one of the more modestly effective medications to start with, and then gradually increasing the level of efficacy if somebody demonstrates that they're having breakthrough disease, or starting at the very beginning with a highly effective medication and just proceeding from there. And so we are taking part in this one on the top, Deliver MS. In addition to discussion of the way these medications work and how effective they are, there's also, of course, the major consideration when we talk about treatments is the financial aspect. And even if you've and your neurologist have discussed which treatment is right for you and you finally made that determination, sometimes costs can be prohibitive. We know that all of these medications have gone up in price from the time they were originally introduced, especially the ones that were introduced in the 90s. They've seen their prices go up many-fold. This was a study that looked at the amount that Medicaid spent per enrollee for the various treatments, and it was looking specifically at what happened after the first introduction of a generic medication. This was a generic version of Copaxone or glutathione acetate. I believe that was 2015 or 2014. And what they found was that there was actually no change in how much Medicaid spent per enrollee despite the introduction of generics. However, this was based on data from a couple of years back, and so potentially in the coming year or two, we may see additional studies like this that now that we will hopefully have more in the way of generics and biosimilars. And this is a similar study showing the rising price that people pay for these medications. Now, of course, people don't necessarily, the patients don't necessarily pay for all of these huge prices out of pocket. Oftentimes, these are done by third-party payers, and patients, in many instances, are able to get discounted drug or free drug directly through the drug manufacturer. I just wanted to mention a couple things about the expanded use of telemedicine. So you may have noticed that many of our visits these days, in fact, all of our visits have been over the past several weeks done through virtual video conferencing as opposed to in-person visits. And this seems to work out for many of you. I would like to refer to this tip sheet, which is available through the Rocky Mountain MS Center website. And if you would just take a moment in the days leading up to your next visit to review this tip sheet so we can have so everybody can have a successful telehealth experience. I think that would really be helpful. And that's really all I have for today. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a very nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Gross. We will include a link to that telehealth tip sheet in our follow-up email to all registrants, or you can find it on the COVID-19 education page at mscenter.org. We will now take another 3-minute break. You can use this time to submit your questions or visit the virtual exhibit hall. Our next presentation features Dr. Enrique Alvarez. Dr. Alvarez is the clinic director at the Rocky Mountain MS Center at CU. His research interests and projects include retrospective chart reviews and examining how patients have done in clinic outside of clinical trials to better understand how patients have done with their various treatments. Dr. Alvarez is presenting an update on COVID-19 and MS. If you would like to see all of the information on COVID-19 that the Rocky Mountain MS Center has compiled, including previous updates from Dr. Alvarez, please visit mscenter.org and click on the banner for our COVID-19 education page. The following presentation was recorded on May 7th with information known at that time.
This is Enrique Alvarez. I'm one of the neurologists at the Rocky Mountain MS Center at the University of Colorado. I've been there now 7 years, and today I'll be talking a little bit about giving an update on COVID and as it relates to multiple sclerosis. So we've been doing a series of these over the last few weeks, but to kind of provide a little bit more background, I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about timeline and flattening the curve as it relates to COVID. A lot of news on this has been addressed and things, but to kind of provide a little bit of some of the numbers and modeling as it that it have affected sort of how we've dealt with things here in Colorado. We'll talk a little bit about reopening. That's the phase we're starting to kind of slowly progress towards. And then additionally, we will be doing some talking about testing, and we'll talk a little bit about disease-modifying therapies and sort of the experience in the world as it relates to this. So one of the things to think about is how much our world has changed in really no time. So if we recognize that in December 31st was the report of several cases of pneumonia that came to light out of Wuhan, China, we can see that it's impressive that we're in May and how much our lives have changed in that short period of time. They identified the virus in almost record time. So in January 7th, they identified the virus. This is the official name, SARS-CoV-2. It's the most related virus to SARS, which went through southern China as well. And we often refer to it as COVID or COVID-19, and for simplicity, we'll just be calling it COVID during this presentation. And these are coronaviruses. So coronaviruses are the viruses that we often refer to as the common cold, a little bit different from the influenza viruses that cause the seasonal flus. But we start moving along this timeline, and by January 11th, we hear about the first death occurring in China, and that by January 13th, we start to hear about the first cases starting to happen outside of China, particularly it happened in Thailand. And as the timeline starts to move, we start to hear about sort of the first clinical trials in the U.S. With remdesivir, which is a treatment that was originally developed for Ebola, and that that recently, some of you may be aware of, was starting to get used and somewhat temporarily approved in the U.S. By the FDA. Again, very recently, as of early last week. We had some difficulties initially with testing, and we'll talk a little bit about that, what that all entails and some of the issues that happened. But as we know, some of the testing initially was faulty. And then by March, we start to already looking at 100,000 cases, 4,000 deaths in over 100 countries. By April 2nd, we're starting to talk about 1 million confirmed cases. By April 10th, we start talking about 100,000 deaths globally from this. And these numbers, as you know, are already a little bit outdated as the cases have continued to increase. So there's been a lot of modeling that's happened. One of the main agencies that has been doing a lot of the modeling is out of the University of Washington. The IHME is a publicly available website, so you can go through and look at these models. They get updated every few days. And this was actually just updated about 2 days ago. And again, this recording, just for reference, is on May 7th. But and these were actually new views. So to show a little bit of the infections, and these numbers particularly are specific to the state of Colorado. And what we can see is that the estimated infections started to occur a little bit before March 1st, end of February, with sort of a fairly rapid increase in number of cases. And it's predicted that the number of cases actually started to decrease in the community. As you can see, the line of daily tests did not match these numbers. So this is a little bit of an exercise in estimating and guesstimating the number of cases that are out there. As the number of tests ramped up, you can see that more and more patients were getting diagnosed. And then there was a little bit of a decrease. This is really when the ramp up of testing started to occur, and that was mid-April. And that was a huge benefit for us to be able to start screening patients during this time. And here in March and early April, it was not too uncommon to wait 10 days or longer sometimes to get some of this testing back, which made it very difficult. Because of all this testing, you can get sort of this increase of confirmed infections, but you can see that the number of confirmed infections really lags sort of what's estimated to have been the case of real infections out there. We can superimpose on this graph deaths, and these are not to the same scale, but you can see that there's a lag between sort of the number of infections and the number of deaths, and that these are pushed out approximately 2 to 3 weeks. This is helpful to realize that a lot of times if you're looking at deaths, that this is an indicator of something that really happened 2 to 3 weeks earlier, which is the estimated infections. But you can see that the curves really match up well with sort of these guesstimated number of infections as they occurred. And then we're starting to see maybe a little bit of a peak at the end here as things are starting to reopen, and we'll talk about that shortly. One of the most important reasons to use this modeling was to be able to understand the number of cases and whether or not we were going to be able to handle these cases. Again, this is modeling from just a few days ago, and the very critical, important levels are the number of hospital beds that are available. In the state of Colorado, it's just under 5,000. And the number of ICU beds available, which is slightly over 500. When we look at the number of hospital beds that we thought we were going to need, you can see that we're staying way under this, and that our max peak was probably around 1,000 beds. And now we're in this phase where the number of cases is starting to come down. These other lines represent the number of ICU beds, and those ICU beds that were requiring intubators. As you know, there was concerns for shortages of intubators. And you can say, well, what was all the fuss about? We had a lot of extra capacity around this time, although you did see that, about half of the ICU beds in the state of Colorado at one point were being used strictly for COVID patients. And that implied having to holding a lot of other surgeries to get pushed off so that we could handle these COVID cases. This doesn't look terrible, but this is what the initial models look like. This was some of the very early models that showed that the number of hospital beds in the state of Colorado that we were going to need was going to be way over that of 5,000 and what we could really handle. And that's what you saw happening in New York, where they started having to use the convention centers as hospitals, where they were starting to kind of think about needing to put 2 patients on one ventilator. And things like that. And so we can see that the number of ICU patients was over twice that of what we could safely handle. Again, these were kind of models, and thankfully we started taking measures to try and prevent that from happening. And some of that was social distancing. So as far as social distancing, one of the things that started to occur was being able to flatten out those curves, and that allowed us to start looking at this, at these cases, and trying to prevent sort of that overpowering of the hospital. This slide shows kind of the opposite end, the stage we're at now, where we're starting to open up and kind of relaxing some of the social distancing rules. And this is the plan that these were bullet points that we would have to meet in order to be able to open up things again. And you can see this was a proposal from the CDC and President Trump, where we had to have a number of symptoms, cases, and hospitals meeting criteria before we really should be thinking about opening things up. On the symptom side, we needed to look at flu-like type symptoms, or at least COVID-like type symptoms decreasing for 2 weeks or 14 days. This is a little bit harder to track, so I'm not going to talk too much more about this because a lot of colds and flus can look like COVID, and it's hard to tell without having good testing. On the number of cases, we wanted to see a downward trajectory for 14 days in either documented cases or in positive and confirmed positive tests. So in either suspected or confirmed cases. And importantly, on the hospital side, we wanted to have the capacity at the hospital end to be able to treat all the patients without having to go into certain circumstances called crisis care, and basically emergency type rules for caring of patients in the hospital where maybe we can't provide ideal care as much. The part we'll talk about a little bit later is the testing. I think it becomes really important that we have testing, because without testing, we're making a lot of guesses as to who has COVID and who doesn't. And especially the emerging antibody testing, we wanted to have this available because it allows us to screen people in certain situations. It might help us with evaluating for convalescent plasma. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that later. But let's start looking at the number of cases. This is a graph showing the increased number of COVID positive cases in the state of Colorado. And you can see that these numbers are all over the place and very much jumpy. And some of this has to do with reporting of cases. This peak here had to do with adding patients that were suspected of COVID, related to patients who had 10 later tested positive for COVID and had similar symptoms, and they were added in. Initially, they were only looking at confirmed positives. And so you can see that these bulks end up happening kind of gradually throughout this. You have effects of the weekends where sometimes the reporting isn't quite as ideal over the weekend, and they get reported on Monday and then maybe recorded on Tuesday. And so one way to deal with this is to do a moving average. If you look at a 3-day moving average of cases, and it helps smooth out these curves a little bit, it's possible to see that in March we had this increase in cases, and towards April, mid-April, we start to see a little bit of a decreasing number of cases. There was a small, again, increase in cases, more than likely attributed to this bulk of patients that were included from much prior that were not confirmed. So if you can skip that and kind of look at just this, what's impressive a little bit is that it hasn't really been until April 26th, 27th that we started to see this decrease in the number of cases. The important point is that we're starting to see this decrease. And remember, April 27th was when things in the state of Colorado started to open up. That, of course, got a little bit more delayed in certain communities, including Denver County and some of the other metro counties, where through May 8th, they still have some of the stay-at-home regulations and guidelines. So here we can see that a little bit better, just kind of that smoothing out of the curve. One of the concerns that we have is that in our hospital, at least in the UC Health System, so this is including Poudre Valley, Memorial, and Denver, respectively, up in Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, and Aurora, is that the number of patients admitted to the hospital basically since beginning of April have been really stable. And some of this are patients that are sick and just kind of staying in the system. So this may be delayed as far as number of cases. And over the last few days, we're starting to see a little bit of a decrease. But again, this is not cutting off that much earlier from this, maybe from a week ago. So with having sort of a decrease in number of cases, one of the things that we started that I mentioned was this relaxing of social distancing. And we can see that as a state that the stay-at-home order was stopped on April 27th, or at least it expired, I should say. The non-essential businesses closed. Some of this started to get relaxed, but you still see that some of the other measures for social distancing are still enforced. This is a little bit slowed again in some of the other counties, such as Denver and some of the other metro counties. But what we can see is that the change in mobility, so just you can look at numbers of a number of different ways to look at how people are distancing themselves, things such as how much gas are people using, what's the electricity use, how many cars are driving by certain points on roads. And looking at some of those measures, the state or using this modeling, this is actually again coming in from the University of Washington, that the social distancing kind of by mid-March started approaching 30%. And with the stay-at-home orders, according to this model, achieved somewhere between 55 to 60%. Some of the numbers from the state of Colorado suggest that this number may have been as high as 75%, which really allowed for that flattening of the curve that we discussed earlier. As we can see then, as they're relaxing and people getting tired of some of these measures, you can start seeing a little bit of gradual social relaxation that happens, and things are starting to kind of change again. This will probably kind of continue to come up as we relax things out a little bit more. But these are the kind of models that are being used for that and that allow us to evaluate when we can start to open things up. This is a little bit how the university is looking at opening up. So things started very slowly on Monday, April 27th. The main campus is located in Aurora, and we were able to start doing some of this stuff. I can tell you not much really happened that very first week. There was a lot of planning happening. And the first phase really involved trying to get some of the procedures and priority visits back in. And these were patients that needed surgeries that had been pushed off, that really could wait a little bit but couldn't wait too much longer. And the goal was trying and get back to no more than 30% of patient volumes compared to what we had before. The reality is that, for example, in neurology, we got up to maybe 10% of what we had before COVID. And then the idea is to not increase more than 10% per week after that. This is 2 weeks later, and I can tell you we're nowhere near 50% of our clinic volumes being sort of in face-to-face type encounters. At the university for neurology, we're maybe up to about 15%. And so really expect that over the next several months that most of the MS telehealth, most of the MS visits will be occurring via telehealth. Some of the new visits will probably be the priority because it's a little bit harder to evaluate somebody via telehealth. And so if you're meeting somebody for the first time, you're going to want to see them face to face. It's a little bit easier to review MRIs, patients bring in their records and things like that. And so we really want to emphasize, those visits as opposed to some of the return visits in clinic. One of the things I'll just bring it up as hints is that, if you can if you're doing a face-to-face visit, consider bringing your own mask if possible. There are some cloth masks that are starting to be dispensed at the hospital, but again, these are limited and in short supply. So if you have your own mask, please bring it. And then just the emphasis to bring in records, MRIs. We always emphasize this. Patients that have been around will know this, but especially if you're looking at coming and joining us, anything that you can think about trying to bring that in right away with you in those visits, that will help cut down on having to do follow-up visits to look at those MRIs and things like this. So make those visits much more efficient. And so always try to remember to bring those in. So let's talk a little bit about testing. The very first type of testing that occurred was this RT-PCR testing. I'm including this kind of complicated picture up here on the top to show probably the most important part of the whole test, and that is having to stick that swab deep inside the nose. If they don't stick it in there good, you're going to get a crappy sample and you're not going to get a lot of the virus. The virus infection starts here in the nose and then slowly migrates down, and there's very little in the nose. It's more in the sinuses areas and these a little bit deeper in. And so if you don't get a good swab, you're not going to be able to pick it up. The technique for picking up these viruses doesn't need a lot of the virus around to have a positive test. And so it becomes, again, I can't emphasize it enough, how important this first step test is. The next part, the RT, is just reverse transcriptase, and that has to do with just that the RNA itself is an RNA virus. There's RNA and DNA. Most cells have DNA, and then it becomes RNA, and then it goes to proteins. In this step, you have to do a conversion of RNA to DNA, which then gets amplified through the PCR reaction. And this can be amplified many fold over. And so very few copies will slowly be amplified through this reaction, and then you can become positive and you can pick it up with these machines that allow you to decide that a test is positive, or if you don't pick anything up, that the test is negative. But if you don't get a good sample, you're just not going to be able to amplify that DNA to be able to pick it up on these tests. So the important point for this as well is that this picks up the actual virus. If you've cleared the virus, the test will be negative. So if you had COVID and now are feeling better and your symptoms have resolved, this COVID testing will not pick it up at all. You have to be shedding the virus. And again, the sample has to be obtained really well. The important point for this is it's only been really over the last couple of weeks that we've had the capacity to do as many tests as we wanted, that the patients, that we can now test anybody who was symptomatic. And there were a lot of restrictions around who could be tested. Initially, only the infectious disease doctors could order the test. It could only be ordered for patients that were admitted to the hospital who had very bad disease and otherwise could not be tested. So even if you came into the ER and you had a runny nose, a cough, and fevers, in those situations, you were getting tested for everything else, including the flu and other types of coronaviruses, because that testing was available. And then if those were all negative, then you could have a COVID testing. And so that caused a lot of delays. As you can imagine, there was a lot of patients that were suspected COVID positive patients that were not necessarily, that had to be evaluated and ruled in or ruled out. In order to do the testing, one of the, I think, coolest things about the things that we've learned about this pandemic is how to do drive-through testing. And there's 2 locations where you can drive through to get this COVID testing. You do require an order from your doctor, but you can go to the Smoking Hill Testing Center in the Anschutz outpatient location. Just actually outside the Anschutz inpatient pavilion, there's a drive-through location. So no need to even come into the hospital. You can pull up and they'll test you right there. So again, the PCR testing is very sensitive and it's very good for detecting people who are very active at the time with their disease. One of the things that happens with this virus that's unique to this virus compared to other types of coronaviruses is that the virus slowly starts to move down into the lower respiratory tract, into the lungs, and leaves the nose area. And so usually within 2 or 3 weeks of an infection, the test just becomes less sensitive because the number of virus particles becomes a lot less in the nose areas. And so it's important to kind of catch people at the right time. And so there's a lot of people who have tested negative because either the disease had progressed into their lower lungs. And so sometimes you're having to do then the testing in washings from your lungs, for example, in order to pick up the virus. one of the requirements for opening things up is that the number of positive tests had to go down, meaning that we think that so that happens two ways. You can test more people. And so we can see that, yes, there were more people being tested. These peaks are just the weekend blips. And that had to do with testing of healthcare providers, which had also some preference so that healthcare providers then weren't spreading the infection into patients as they were seeing them in the emergency room or in the hospital, urgent care facilities, and things like that. And so you can see, however, though, that initially we were able to average out about 160 to 210 tests a day. And these are numbers from the CU health system. So again, north, south, and now on the main campus. And you can see that the slope kind of speeds up, and now we're able to do over 500 tests a day. We're actually kind of limited now just because we're not having that many tests being ordered. So the numbers have actually kind of started to plateau out a little bit, which is fantastic. And what we're starting to be able to see is that the percent positive is actually starting to go down, which is one of those, again, those requirements that we're needing in order to open up some of the businesses and relax some of the things. I think one of the coolest figures I saw was this one from the New York Times that showed for each state where they're at as far as percent of their tests that are positive over the last 7 days. And to be honest, I'm not sure why Colorado is in light blue versus being sort of more in the white area, because I think our trend has been really nicely downsloping, like many of the other states that are in the white. But you can see that some states are still going up, and some of this could be just more testing or in picking up some of those infections, or more people actually having infections. So it's a little bit of two things, but we're starting to meet that criteria that we can in order to start opening things up. The other testing that's getting a lot of publicity right now is serology testing. This involves looking for antibodies to the virus. We started being able to do this as of last week, Friday. And it's still very restricted. And the reason for that is the first testing is really being used to identify patients who are now past an infection and are making a good level of antibodies, who might be willing to then donate some of their blood, some of their plasma, to give it to patients who are sick, with the idea that maybe some of those antibodies can be protective for people who are really sick. And so we want to prioritize that kind of testing. Otherwise, this is good testing to try and figure out who in the past was infected, to take a little bit of a public health question. It doesn't matter too much to show that you were infected in the past or not, if you've recovered already. And to some extent, it's good to know, but it's not going to change what you do to that person, because that person now is doing well. It might allow us to feel a bit more comfortable if those antibodies are protective. However, the testing that we have doesn't tell us if those antibodies are protective or immune. And so we have to be a little bit cautious to interpret that if we have those antibodies, that you don't need to worry about being around people who are sick. And that's a big concern at this point. So some of the things to consider about this testing, and here I'll get into some of the minutiae of what you've been hearing in the media a lot. So how good a test is at picking up patients who have disease is the sensitivity. And the FDA has set sort of a goal of having to pick up at least 90%. On the specificity, that's trying to tell you that if you have a positive test, what's the likelihood that you actually had COVID? And remember, COVID is a type of coronavirus, and it's very similar to other types of coronaviruses. And so you want to make sure that it doesn't pick up, for example, people who have had the common cold. It's not helpful to have a test that tells you, yeah, you got exposed to the common cold and maybe COVID. We need to know that. The FDA has set a goal for this for 95 for diseases that are not that prevalent, that are not that common in the population. If you have a high rate of picking up patients who did not have the disease, it's going to inflate those small numbers really high. And that was the problem with some of the very early testing. The test, for example, that was rolled out at National Jewish has a specificity of 90%. So meaning 10% chance that that test is going to tell you that you got infected with COVID when you really weren't. And for this, we want a test that's really specific. And ideally, we want to look at things that are 98.5% or higher. I can tell you that the testing that's being looked at the University of Colorado is over 99, and a lot of times 99.3, 99.6% specific. So that becomes really important. How available will the test be? Well, right now it's not very available, but the plan is that in a week or two that testing is going to become much more available and available clinically, which is important. Do the antibodies tell you that you're protected? And this is what we were referring to. And then how do you use it? And what protein will you test? So this handy, cool picture that I think has made the media a lot shows that there's different types of proteins. This is the protein that's actually binding the cells. And so, for example, if you test for this protein, the chances are is that there's at least a higher chance that those antibodies might be neutralizing or protective versus maybe proteins or antibodies that are detecting proteins that are farther away from that. And so it becomes informative to know what is the different protein that's being used to test. Remember, you're going to test, for example, for antibodies to this protein or that protein very specifically in these tests. Our body will probably have made a host of different antibodies to all the different proteins, but it's possible that you may not. And one of the things we'll talk about with patients on immunosuppressive drugs is maybe you don't quite make as much of those antibodies, so the testing may not be as good in patients that are immunosuppressed versus patients who are not immunosuppressed. The other thing is not all antibodies are created equal. And so you have antibodies that are made initially with an infection called IgMs. These take usually several days to be made, and then they get converted into a different type of antibody called an IgG. And so if you look for IgMs, you might be able to pick up the infection earlier. If you look for IgGs, these antibodies might last longer, so you might be able to go back further in time to test a patient and see if they're positive. The important point for this is these are usually not positive for days or weeks after you've had COVID. So this is not the kind of test where if you're feeling cruddy and you have a runny nose and a fever that you want to do. This is much more of a test that allows you to test whether or not somebody was exposed and had an infection that they cleared of COVID. And so knowing what you're testing for becomes important. So what are the risks for MS patients and immunosuppression? Well, at this point, the U.S. came late to the party, and sometimes there's advantages to that. One of the things that allows us to learn is communicating with our colleagues. And there's been frequent calls happening with a lot of our colleagues from around the world. Particularly one of the organizations that was very instrumental in spreading the word in a way was the International Women in MS group. And they've invited us men to be able to at least listen in for these calls, and it's been very helpful. They meet once a week via Zoom type conference, and it allows us to hear the experience in other parts of the world that were affected by MS much earlier. And what we can see is that the risks do not appear to be higher in patients with MS. In other words, MS patients get COVID at the same rates as other people do. And then the outcomes, how people do, appear to be the same for those patients that are on immunosuppressive medications. And so here's a little bit of the data that we can share through these presentations and that we've been hearing about. We have sort of the first paper published that just came out on May 30th. And unfortunately, the publication process is not fast. And so this is already a month-old data, month and a week. And this was looking at the Italian experience. It does include a few patients outside of Italy, but it's mostly the Italian experience. In which case, here they're reporting on 232 patients with MS who developed COVID. And notice how little testing they've had available, where only 57 of these cases were confirmed, while 175 were suspected cases. In this paper, they report 5 deaths, 3 of which were on no treatment. And from this call, we learned that they did have 1 additional death at this point. And so this allows us to say, hey, these numbers are kind of in line with the general population. We have to remember that mortality of MS in Italy, for example, for people who tested positive was in the order of 8+%. And so it's 5 deaths out of 232 is a fairly low percentage, which allows us to kind of feel a little bit more reassured and comforted by that. And then realizing that most of these patients were not on treatment, so we're not seeing that specific drugs really seem to increase the risk of developing bad outcomes, particularly death. And they looked at hospitalizations and other things like this, and the same holds for that as well. And you can see that there were patients on pretty much all the treatments that we use for MS. We can look at the Spanish registry as well. So here they identified 117 patients. This number is getting closer to 300, but they're still putting the data together. They had 77 women and 40 men. The average age was 43. So you can see this information. This is relapse and remitting MS, secondary progressive and primary progressive. They still have that in Spanish. With the Spanish abbreviations and commas or decimal points. But the important number is looking at death. So 2 deaths out of 117 patients. Again, very similar to the numbers that we're seeing out of Italy. They did not reveal which treatments they were on, but these are the treatments of the patients that were throughout most that were testing positive. And again, only 44% of the patients were positive via PCR. So still guessing at some of these numbers. And if you have a great memory, you might realize that in the US and especially in our hospital, the testing for people who had concerns for COVID was only about a 13 to 15% positive rate. So it raises a lot of questions as to whether or not the suspected cases even had COVID or if they had flu or other things. And so those are kind of 2 big countries outside of the US. So the US joined a little bit later, so we're still catching up a little bit. We're a big country though, so we caught up pretty fast. And the National MS Society provided funding for this COVIMS database. And I'm very happy to proud to report that Ann Cross, my former mentor at Washington University in St. Louis, was very involved in developing this database. And these slides are from her, so my thanks and appreciation for sending these slides over so I can share them with you. And so 2 main questions that we're trying to get developed by this registry was, how do patients with MS as a group fare with COVID-19, and how do individual DMTs affect outcomes? And so patients are coming in and telling us that they have COVID-19, and then we report it into this database. And the database is de-identified so that we don't know who has who the patients are that we're reporting. And we want to have some sense of what the outcomes are. So there's a little bit of delay that we're intentionally building into this reporting so that we can report to see how people are doing. So we can see that we've had 143 patients get reported as of May 2nd. There was 137 confirmed MS, radiologically isolated syndrome for 1. Some NMO and MOG patients are getting reported in as well. And this database is restricted to these diagnoses for the most part. Mostly a Caucasian disease, so no surprise that it's mostly white patients who are developing COVID. And again, about 4 or 3 women to every man who develops MS. So the ratios here are pretty much matching kind of a MS prevalence type study. We can access this data, and so we can look at it. And these are the latest numbers, and you can see that this number of 137 has jumped to 157 in the matter of just a few days, and this was pulled up as of this morning. We can look at the spread across different types of MS. Most patients are relapse and remitting, so no surprise there. Most patients are being treated, so no surprise that 86% of the patients in the US are on the disease-modifying therapy. In the US, because testing has ramped up a little bit faster, we do have 103 patients that are laboratory confirmed, so they're PCR. For the most part, again, the serology is not quite available yet. But most of the patients here are confirmed as opposed to what we're hearing from other places. And then when you look at the outcomes, we can spread it out and we can see that unfortunately we did have 6 patients who have passed. Again, not split out by who, sort of the demographics here too much. So let's turn into some of this information. Some of this data was a little bit older. And so we can see that there's been, of those 6 patients and compared to the total cases, that they tend to be older patients. And that's not a surprise given the experience that we've had with COVID. As we look at here, not a lot of differences in the type of disease course. That's a difference. Again, because these are older patients, they're much more likely to be secondary progressive patients. They were on a variety of different treatments, and they had a fair number of comorbidities, much more so than patients who did well. And we can see again that we had a broad smattering of treatments in which these patients were on when they developed COVID. And so the idea sometimes that we talk about some of these drugs being safer or things like this, we can see that, patients on Copaxone or interferons were still developing COVID, for example. There's a question whether or not these patients on ocrelizumab were much more likely to be reported, and that maybe that's why it accounts for a higher percentage here. It's a little bit hard, and I've not seen recent data as to what percentage of the populations are on these different treatments. But what I can say is that ocrelizumab has been one of the medications that's been used the most recently and has a decent market share. So it's maybe not too surprising that we see ocrelizumab is listed as one of the most common medications to be on here. So we can talk a little bit about the experience at the Rocky Mountain MS Center. We can report that we've had 10 patients be diagnosed or suspected diagnosis with COVID-19. 6 of them were for MS, 2 were NMO patients, and then with 1 autoimmune encephalitis and 1 Hashimoto's encephalitis. A lot of our patients were on rituximab, and that just has to do with a lot of our patients being on rituximab, especially patients with NMO and these encephalitises are preferentially treated with rituximab. You can see that the MS patients really then were on a smattering of other drugs. The average age for our patients was 47.1 with a really broad spectrum. Again, a lot of women in our group, as we would expect. We had 7 confirmed cases, and I added that to the wrong group. So actually, should say that would actually be, and I added it wrong. Sorry, I apologize for that. So that should be 3 suspected and 7 confirmed. And then when we look at our deaths, we did have 3 deaths in our center. So 1 was a patient with MS. 1 was a patient with neuromyelitis optica, and 1 was an autoimmune encephalitis patient. The average age for these patients was 56.3. 1 of these was a man, 2 were women. 1 of the patients was on ocrelizumab and 2 on rituximab. This brings up the question as to whether the B-cell directed therapies might have an increased risk of causing death in patients. So let's talk about that a little bit more in detail. I stole this presentation slide from June 5th, kind of the European way to write some of these dates. May 6th, which was Wednesday. I apologize. But we had, and so from Roche, the makers of ocrelizumab, and we had 100 cases reported on ocrelizumab, 74 confirmed, 26 unconfirmed. most of these patients we see were not hospitalized. 26 were hospitalized. Some have started to recover. We can see that if we follow these, there had not been a death yet on ocrelizumab. We had not reported our patient yet because that death just occurred over the weekend, and we're gearing up to provide the data, and by the time it gets processed and incorporated, so we will be doing that shortly. But we can see that out of 100 patients, we do have some bad outcomes. ICU, ventilator, CPAP is a type of ventilator, a lot of times a little bit less fancy than a regular type of ventilator. And so I suspect that some of this is just because it's delayed. So I described our patient, for example, who died, and it just takes time to kind of report that patient. We're also waiting to hear those outcomes. And so people not doing well take longer to get better. And so some of this may be a little bit delayed. So I think the important thing is to kind of keep watching the news and seeing where things go. Let me talk about this a little bit. So when we talk about COVID, we have the respiratory infection. That's the common cold part, if you want to think about it. There's this pulmonary phase that I talked about, where it's kind of the infection moving up from sort of much more the nose into the lower lungs. And so as you start to see this, we see that fewer patients kind of end up moving this way. That the viral response, as it moves into this, into these patients, move into the stage 2. What ends up happening a little bit is this starts ramping up the host inflammatory response, meaning the immune system really starts to kick up. And in stage 3, it's this hyperinflation phase. And sometimes this is the part that's really causing the death, because it's that junk in the lungs that starts to prevent good oxygen from getting into the lungs. And these are the patients requiring intubation and things. So it doesn't necessarily mean that patients go through all 3 stages, but as you progress, the severity changes. And what we can see is usually in this first stage, it's that dry cough, the fevers, runny noses, things like that. Shortness of breath, low oxygen levels that start to indicate this pulmonary phase. This takes longer to clear. And then the ARDS, septic shock, heart failure, and those kinds of things into that stage 3. I like to bring this up a little bit because we talk about this balance between sort of the hyperactive immune system that happens in MS, where that may or may not necessarily be helpful to try and fight the virus response. Some of our drugs that help lower that immune system to try and keep MS at bay may not necessarily be great drugs to be on during this viral phase. But as you get into this hyperactive stage, it may be helpful to be on these drugs to kind of control some of these inflammatory type markers. And so if we can control that, some of the patients may do a little bit better. And that may be why we're seeing some of the cases not end up doing so bad as we might expect it to be. And so it's important to kind of remember that the immune system is important, that we need to keep it in balance, and that by doing so, that we can have the best outcomes. And so the reality is we're not sure how to measure which part of the immune system and things like this, and that's important to think about. But it doesn't imply that being on these medications put us at higher risk. They might put us at higher risk of maybe getting the disease. Maybe we would have a little bit longer of this viral response phase. But again, it might be beneficial at the back end of it. So just to conclude, we can see that thankfully that COVID-19 cases are coming down slowly, that the social separation that we did was extremely effective, and that we need to continue it. We can start to loosen it, and that it is safe. It appears to be safe. We've met a lot of the goals recently around being able to try and open things up a little bit more so, but it doesn't mean that we can throw all caution in the air and that we need to proceed with caution. I think my biggest recommendations is you got to get out of the house. The weather is beautiful. You got to exercise. You got to eat right. You got to take care of yourself to be able to stay well. And so I think that's the message that I would do that. We got to wash our hands, but please don't lock yourself at home. and get out and do things. MS patients, even on immunosuppression, are not at increased risk, it appears. Again, we need a lot more information. We need to start combining data from all these countries, but looking at smatterings of data from some of the hardest hit areas of the world, we are not seeing particularly bad outcomes in some of these patients. Based on this information very recently, and contrary to what I mentioned in prior updates, we are starting to continue. For continuing of infusions, we want them to continue as planned. We're no longer delaying infusions. If you're starting infusions, we want you to start those. And this applies for disease-modifying therapies. It applies for the infusions as well. We want to control MS. MS is a bad disease in and of itself. And so if you're a newly diagnosed patient, we want you to start treatment. If you are on treatment, we want you to continue those infusions. Things like Tysabri and Gilenya, we have to be careful about because stopping at cold turkey can reactivate MS. And so we have to be doing that in a coordinated fashion with providers. I think the other issue that we've emphasized, and maybe I emphasize it too much and wrongly, was the idea that hospitals are not safe. We were trying to keep people away from hospitals. And the reason to that is to keep them safe. So as we open things up, we're taking a lot of measures to keep the hospitals as safe as we can. And we're not seeing the hospital rates of infections like we're seeing in some of the other countries in the world. And so we really do want to reassure you that if we're providing, the guidance that it's okay to continue to do these infusions, that it's safe to continue to do those infusions. Things like routine MRIs, we're pushing out some of these other things still. Again, we're trying to clear out the hospital for emergent type things. And so if we need fewer people to man the MRIs, that gives us more people to man the operating rooms, to man the ICUs. Slowly, some of these rules are going to get pushed out or are going to get relaxed a little bit, and they'll keep us allowing us to do those MRIs. If we have symptoms, we can totally do MRIs. We can get people in within a day or two. That is not a problem. But if it's just kind of a routine, I'm doing my every 2-year MRI, let's push some of that out. Some of the routine labs, we're pushing some of those out. If we see something abnormal that we're following it, we can do blood work. You can go through the drive-by testing, so you don't even need to come into the hospital to do some of that testing. And again, if you are coming for face-to-face visits, we are open. You can bring a mask, please. Bring your records just to make those visits as efficient as possible. And so with that, I am done. We don't have too much any more questions. And with that, I appreciate your attention today. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
This concludes our program today. I would like to extend a huge thank you to our presenters for all of their work in putting together this slightly modified version of the Education Summit so that we can continue to provide cutting-edge education to all of you. Thank you, viewers, for staying home and staying safe. And thank you to all of the companies and individuals who have provided patient education grants, sponsorships, and donations in support of the Education Summit. Please remember to fill out the online evaluation and to submit your questions in the comments, or by emailing them to education@mscenter.org. Watch our social media for the next week for videos of those questions getting answered. And please visit our virtual exhibit hall. Have a great rest of your weekend.